There is a sound that exists at the edge of everything, a sound so old and so patient that it has outlived every empire, every god, every name carved into stone. It is the sound of wind moving across sand, not the sharp cutting wind of a storm, but the slow ancient exhale of a desert that has been breathing for millions of years. It moves without urgency. It shifts grains of quartz and feldspar from one dune face to another, with the same indifference it has always shown to the passage of time, and it carries with it a warmth that is not the warmth of comfort, but the warmth of something much older than comfort, the warmth of the earth itself, turning slowly in the dark of space, offering its face to a sun that has never once failed to rise. Close your eyes, or let them grow soft and unfocused, and imagine that you are standing at the edge of an ocean, not an ocean of water, but an ocean of sand, stretching in every direction as far as the eye can reach, as far as the mind can push, before it gives up and simply accepts the enormity of what lies before it, the Sahara. The word itself sounds like the whisper of that wind, like sand sliding against sand in the last light of afternoon. The Sahara is not one thing. It is many things, a vast and plural landscape of golden ergs, those great seas of dune that roll and curl like frozen waves, and flat, hammered sheets of gravel called regs, and plateaus of dark volcanic rock that rise like the bones of the earth pushing through its skin. It is a place of extraordinary and pitiless beauty, a beauty that does not invite you in, but simply exists, with or without your presence, with or without your admiration. And in the middle of all of this, threading its way from south to north across more than 4,000 miles of the most inhospitable terrain on the surface of the earth, there is a river, a single, improbable, magnificent river. A blue thread, you might call it, laid across a world of gold, the Nile. When you see it from high above, from the perspective of a bird riding a thermal current over the desert, it is almost shocking, almost impossible to process. This ribbon of living green that cuts through the dead and golden world on either side. Because where the Nile goes, life follows. Not just life, but extravagance, an almost violent lushness of palm trees and papyrus reeds and cultivated fields that are so brilliantly green, they look painted, look curated, look like a deliberate act of artistry by something greater than chance. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the rich black soil that the Nile deposited each year during its great annual flooding. They called it Kemet, the Black Land, and they called the desert on either side of it Dishret, the Red Land. These were not merely geographical descriptions. They were moral categories. The Black Land was life, fertility, order, civilization, everything that the Egyptian world valued and tried to sustain. The Red Land was chaos, danger, foreignness, the realm of Set, the storm god, the breaker of things. To step from the green edge of the Nile's floodplain into the hot sand of the desert was, in the Egyptian imagination, to step from the world of meaning into the world of disorder. And yet the desert was also a protector. It was the desert that kept invaders at bay for thousands of years, that isolated this extraordinary civilization in its narrow green corridor and allowed it to develop along its own particular and remarkable lines. The Nile itself is not one river but two. At the city of Khartoum in modern Sudan, two great rivers meet and become one. The Blue Nile comes rushing down from the highlands of Ethiopia, carrying with it the rich volcanic silt that made the Nile Delta one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the world. The White Nile comes from much farther south, from the great equatorial lakes of East Africa, from Lake Victoria and its vast, shallow surface catching the rain of a tropical sky. Together, these two rivers form the Nile that the ancient Egyptians knew, the Nile that gave them everything, the river they called Itaru, the Great River, or sometimes simply Happy, the name of the god of the inundation, who was depicted as a blue or green figure with a generous belly and the heavy breasts of fertility, carrying in his hands the gifts of water and abundance. The flow of the Nile was, for thousands of years, one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. The Greeks and Romans could not understand how a river could flood in summer when all other rivers ran at their lowest levels. They invented explanations involving underground caverns and melting snows and seasonal winds, none of which were correct. The answer, of course, was the Ethiopian highlands, where the annual monsoon rains fell in unimaginable quantities each summer, filling the Blue Nile until it burst its banks and sent its waters surging north across the desert, spreading out across the floodplain of Egypt in a great, shallow, gleaming sheet of water. This was the inundation, the annual miracle that the Egyptians called Akhet, the flooding season, and it was the foundation upon which their entire civilization rested. Without the inundation, there was no Egypt. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Without the annual deposit of fresh silt, the thin strip of cultivable land along the Nile's banks would have been exhausted within a generation. Without the water itself, carried deep into the soil by the flooding, and then drawn up through the dry months by the roots of wheat and barley and flax, the crops that fed the Egyptian people and their gods and their armies would simply not have grown. The inundation was everything. It was so central to Egyptian life and Egyptian thought that the entire Egyptian year was organized around it, divided into 3 seasons that tracked the river's behavior. Akhet, the flooding from roughly June to September. Peret, the growing season from October to February, when the waters withdrew and the farmers planted their seeds in the rich black mud. And Shemu, the harvest, from March to May, when the grain was cut and threshed and stored, and the land began to dry under the hammer of the summer sun before the great flooding came again to renew everything. Imagine standing at the edge of the Nile in late June. The river has been running low and slow for weeks, a narrow channel between banks of cracked, pale mud. The air is hot and still. The date palms stand motionless. And then you notice something. The water has a slightly different color today, a faint reddish tinge from the iron-rich soils of Ethiopia mixing with the river's flow. And the level has risen, almost imperceptibly, just a few centimeters overnight. But the Egyptian farmer standing beside you notices, because the Egyptian farmer has been watching this river all his life, as his father watched it and his grandfather before him. He knows what this slight coloring means. He knows what this almost imperceptible rise in the water level means. He turns to you and there is something in his face that is not quite relief, because relief implies uncertainty, and he has no uncertainty about this. The inundation comes. It always comes. What is in his face is something more like gratitude or recognition. The recognition of a beloved face seen again after a long absence. Over the following weeks, the river rises. It rises slowly and then more quickly, spreading out across the low-lying fields in great shallow sheets that reflect the sky above them. The mud houses of the villages stand on slightly raised ground, and the farmers and their families watch from their doorways as the water advances, not with fear but with something closer to reverence. Children splash in the shallows at the edge of the flood, catching the small fish that have been carried down from the south. Women fill their clay jars with the precious water. Old men sit and watch the river rise with the quiet satisfaction of those who have seen this miracle many times and never quite ceased to marvel at it. The Nile's banks, in the days before the great dams were built, were lined with a particular landscape that was unlike anything else on earth. The dense thickets of papyrus that grew in the shallow water at the river's edge, their tall stems topped with their feathery, explosive crowns, stood in great green masses that rustled and swayed with every breath of wind, that hid entire worlds within their stems. Hippopotami moved through the deeper channels, their enormous bodies almost weightless in the water, their small eyes and ears and nostrils breaking the surface like a series of improbable islands. Crocodiles lay on the mud banks in the sun, their armor-plated bodies perfectly still, their eyes half-lidded, their ancient patience making every wading bird and every small child near the water's edge a subject of intense and secret interest. The birds were extraordinary. Herons stood motionless in the shallows, grey and elegant, and utterly absorbed in the business of fishing. Ibises picked their way across the mudflats on their stilt-thin legs, their curved beaks probing the soft ground for insects and small invertebrates. Sacred ibises, the birds of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, their white bodies and black heads, and their extraordinary curved beaks like a scribe's brush bent into an arc. Kingfishers flashed above the surface of the water like small explosions of turquoise light. Hoopoes, with their absurd and magnificent crests, their cinnamon and black and white plumage, their calling voices that sounded like someone knocking on a hollow door. Swallows wheeled and dove in the dusk, catching the insects that rose in clouds above the water. And above it all, the sky. The Egyptian sky is unlike any other sky. It is a blue of such depth and such clarity that it seems almost unnatural, almost artificially vivid, a blue that you can feel in your chest when you look up at it. At sunrise, this blue sky turns through gold and orange and pink and a deep burning red at the horizon, and the sun comes up over the edge of the desert like a declaration, like a proclamation, like something willed into being by a force of enormous intention. The ancient Egyptians watched this happen every morning of their lives. They watched the sun emerge from the eastern horizon, and they understood it, without metaphor, without poetry, as the rebirth of the sun god Ra, his bark sailing once again through the blue ocean of the sky, bringing light and warmth and the possibility of another day of life. And each night, when the sun sank into the western horizon in a final blaze of color, they understood that as Ra's descent into the Duat, the underworld, to make his dangerous nightly journey through the realm of darkness and death before being reborn again in the east with the next dawn. This was not primitive thinking, this was profound thinking. This was a people who had looked at the most fundamental pattern of their existence, the alternation of day and night, the cycle of flooding and growing and harvest, the progression of life and death, and had found in all of it a single, coherent, beautiful narrative. Everything was a cycle, everything returned, nothing was ever truly lost. The sun went down, but the sun came back. The river receded, but the river returned. The body died, but the spirit, nourished and protected by the proper rituals, would live on in the beautiful fields of the afterlife. The Egyptian mind was, in its deepest structure, a mind that refused to accept endings, that insisted on continuation, that built its most magnificent monuments as declarations of permanence in a world of change. The earliest Egyptian settlements along the Nile date back to at least 10,000 years before the Common Era, when the climate of North Africa was wetter and more hospitable than it is today, when what is now the Sahara was a land of grasslands and lakes and wildlife in abundance. As the climate dried and the Sahara spread, these early peoples were pushed toward the Nile, concentrating along its banks in increasing numbers, developing more complex social structures and more sophisticated technologies to manage the river and its resources. By around 3100 BCE, something remarkable had happened. Two separate kingdoms, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, had been unified under a single ruler. The tradition says this was accomplished by a king named Narmer or Menes, and the event is commemorated in one of the oldest surviving works of Egyptian art, the Narmer Palette, a ceremonial slate plaque that shows a king in the white crown of Upper Egypt smiting an enemy, and then in the red crown of Lower Egypt inspecting the bodies of his foes. With this unification, the history of pharaonic Egypt begins, not immediately in its full flower, not immediately with the pyramids and the temples and the vast bureaucratic machinery of the state, but the seed has been planted, the structure is in place, the river is flowing, and the black soil is ready for what will grow from it. For the next 3,000 years and more, this civilization will build and rebuild itself along the banks of the Nile, will create art and architecture and literature and science and religion of extraordinary sophistication, will worship its gods and bury its dead with a care and an attention to detail that still moves us 3,000 years later when we stand before the artifacts in our museums and feel something catch in our throats that we cannot quite explain. the period that scholars call the early dynastic period, roughly 317 to 2686 BCE, encompassing the first and second dynasties, is a time of remarkable energy and experimentation. The newly unified state is trying to figure out what it is, what a pharaoh is, how a kingdom is organized, how taxes are collected and recorded, how the enormous bureaucratic task of managing an agricultural civilization along 400 miles of river is to be accomplished. Writing is being developed during this period, first as a simple system of pictographic symbols, and then gradually becoming more complex and more capable of recording the full range of human thought and speech. The hieroglyphic system that will eventually emerge is one of the most beautiful and most sophisticated writing systems ever developed. A system that combines phonetic signs and ideographic signs and determinatives in combinations of extraordinary elegance and flexibility. The tombs of the First Dynasty kings at Abydos are already elaborate structures, with wooden burial chambers surrounded by storerooms filled with everything the dead king might need in the next life. Food and drink and tools and furniture and the bodies of servants sacrificed to serve him in death as they had in life. This practice of retainer sacrifice, disturbing to modern sensibilities, reflects the absolute centrality of the king to the Egyptian worldview. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, the son of Osiris and Isis, the divine force that held the world together and kept chaos at bay. His health and his power were not separate from the health and power of Egypt. They were identical. If the king was strong, Egypt was strong. If the king was weak, the floods might not come or might come too high or too low. The crops might fail. The enemies on the borders might become bold. This understanding of the pharaoh as a cosmic force, as a being who stood at the intersection of the human and the divine, of the mortal and the eternal, is one of the most distinctive and most important features of Egyptian civilization. It explains the pyramids. It explains the vast temples. It explains the elaborate rituals of coronation and the careful protocols of the royal court. It explains the extraordinary care taken to preserve the royal body after death, the mummification process that would eventually become one of the most sophisticated embalming procedures ever developed. The king had to be maintained, protected, sustained in both life and death because the alternative was unthinkable. Without the king, the Ma'at, the divine order that kept the universe functioning, would collapse into Isfet, chaos, and everything would unravel. Into this world, into this moment of enormous energy and ambition and possibility, comes the figure who will change everything, who will take all of this accumulated knowledge and ambition and drive it toward a singular world-altering achievement. His name is Imhotep, and his story begins at the court of the pharaoh Djoser, 3rd dynasty, around 2650 BCE. His name means something like, "He who comes in peace," and he came in peace to a world that was ready to be transformed. Imhotep was a man of remarkable and varied gifts. He was a high official, a vizier, the highest administrative position in the kingdom, reporting directly to the pharaoh. He was a physician, perhaps the most celebrated physician of his age. So celebrated that millennia after his death, the Greeks would identify him with their own god of healing, Asclepius, and the Egyptians themselves would eventually elevate him to the status of a deity. He was an architect. He was an astronomer. He was a writer. He was, in short, one of those rare individuals who seem to contain within themselves the full creative potential of their civilization, who arrive at precisely the right moment to give form and structure to possibilities that have been gestating for generations. When Pharaoh Djoser commissioned him to build a tomb, Imhotep did not build a tomb. He built a revolution. The tombs of the kings before Djoser had been mastabas, flat-topped rectangular structures of mud, brick or stone, modest in their ambitions if not in their purpose. Imhotep looked at these structures, and he thought about them, and he imagined something else. He imagined stacking a series of increasingly smaller mastabas on top of one another, each one a step above the last, rising in a series of receding terraces toward the sky. He imagined building this structure not of mud brick but entirely of limestone, cut from the desert plateau and dressed and fitted together with extraordinary precision. He imagines surrounding it with an elaborate complex of courts and temples and subsidiary structures, all enclosed within a massive limestone wall nearly a mile in length. He imagined, in short, the first great architectural complex in human history. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara is, when you approach it for the first time, a genuinely startling thing. It rises to a height of about 60 meters, not enormous by later standards, but when you consider that nothing remotely like it had ever existed before, that every building preceding it had been low and flat and horizontal, the vertical ambition of the step pyramid is almost shocking. It reaches upward. It insists on upward. It claims the sky as a relevant dimension in a way that no human structure before it had done. And in doing so, it changes something fundamental in the human relationship with stone and with the built world. Picture yourself at Saqqara in the 27th century before the Common Era. You are standing on the edge of the desert plateau, west of the Nile, on the side of the setting sun, the side of death and of the west, where the Egyptians believed the dead went. The air is dry and still and carries the faint mineral smell of limestone dust and the subtler, earthier smell of the desert itself. Around you, hundreds of workers are engaged in a project of staggering complexity. Stonecutters are shaping blocks of limestone with copper tools, the rhythmic sound of chisels on stone creating a continuous, percussive music that you can hear from half a mile away. Gangs of workers are dragging these blocks on wooden sledges across the ground, their feet finding purchase in the sand, their bodies leaning forward into the effort with a collective grunt that rises and falls like breathing. Foremen are shouting instructions. Water carriers move among the workers with their clay jars. Scribes with their pallets and their papyrus are recording everything: the number of blocks cut, the number of workers present, the rations distributed, the progress made, and at the center of all this, directing it, controlling it, imagining it into being, is Imhotep. We have no reliable portrait of him. Nothing that we can be certain shows us his face, but we can imagine him moving through this organized chaos with a particular quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, who can hold the entire complex structure in his mind at once, who can see the finished thing even as he stands in the middle of the incomplete and the provisional. He is not a tall man, perhaps, not a physically imposing figure, but there is something in the quality of his attention, in the way he looks at a problem and finds, somewhere in the looking, its solution, that draws every eye in the camp toward him when he appears. The construction of the step pyramid took roughly 20 years, beginning with a simple mastaba of modest dimensions and expanding and elaborating through multiple phases of redesign until it reached its final form. This process of revision and expansion is itself remarkable because it suggests something about the nature of Imhotep's genius that goes beyond mere technical skill. He was not working from a fixed plan completed before the first stone was laid. He was thinking, experimenting, discovering the possibilities of the material as he worked with it, expanding the vision as the vision expanded the builder. This is the method not of a craftsman but of an artist, and it is perhaps this quality more than any other that distinguishes Imhotep as a truly extraordinary figure. The limestone of the step pyramid complex is a particular kind of limestone, fine-grained and pale, quarried from the plateau on which the complex stands. When it was first cut, it would have been almost white, gleaming under the Egyptian sun with a brilliance that must have been visible from miles away. A landmark, a beacon, a declaration in stone of the pharaoh's divine power and the kingdom's ambition. The outer casing stones were dressed to a smooth finish, and the walls of the complex were decorated with carved and painted reliefs, the quality of which, even in their fragmentary state, tells us that Imhotep did not consider his work merely a structural achievement, but an aesthetic one, a thing to be looked at and experienced, not just used. Walking through the remains of the Saqqara complex today, even in its ruined state, even stripped of most of its original casing stones and its decorated surfaces, you can feel the organizing intelligence behind it. The courtyards are not random spaces, but carefully calibrated relationships between mass and void, between the weight of stone and the openness of sky. The dummy chapels that line some of the courts, structures that look like small buildings from the outside but are in fact solid blocks of stone with no interior, are a fascinating example of the Egyptian concern with appearance and with symbolic form. The dead king needed these buildings not to use them but to have them. Their presence was sufficient. Reality and representation occupied the same space in the Egyptian imagination. The courtyard at the southern end of the complex, the South Court, contains two mysterious curved stones called the bee stones, and running along the base of the complex's great enclosure wall, there is a band of blue-green faience tiles that imitates the woven reed hangings that might have decorated a royal palace in the time when mud brick was the primary building material. Imhotep was doing something astonishing here. He was translating the forms of perishable materials, wood and reed and mud brick, into the permanent form of stone, preserving in stone the memory of earlier architectural traditions, even as he was creating something entirely new. The Stip Pyramid complex is simultaneously an act of creation and an act of remembrance, a record of where Egyptian architecture had been and a vision of where it was going, and the space between those two things is where Imhotep himself stands. The pharaoh Djoser was, it seems, delighted with his architect. He gave Imhotep extraordinary honors, including the rare distinction of having his name inscribed on the base of the pharaoh's own statue, alongside the king's. This was not a small thing. The names inscribed in Egyptian monuments were not mere labels, they were acts of power, declarations of existence. To have your name in stone was to have a piece of your identity preserved against the darkness of forgetting. And so Imhotep's name has survived, carved into diorite, across more than 4,500 years. And we speak it today, and in speaking it, we keep faith with that act of extraordinary recognition that the pharaoh extended to his architect in the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era. There is a beautiful tradition, probably apocryphal but beautiful nonetheless, that Imhotep spent evenings alone in the Step Pyramid complex after the workers had gone home, sitting in the silence of the courtyard with the smell of fresh-cut limestone all around him and the stars of the Egyptian night overhead, thinking, just thinking, turning the problems of his project over in his mind the way a jeweler turns a stone in the light, looking for the angle that reveals the best color, the deepest fire. We do not know if this is true. We know almost nothing about the inner life of this man who changed the world. But the image has a rightness to it, a truth that is not about historical fact, but about the nature of creative genius, about the solitude that great thinking requires, about the relationship between the enormous ambitions of civilization and the single quiet mind that sometimes finds a way to give those ambitions form. From Saqqara, the next step in the evolution of Egyptian royal architecture was not immediate. There were several failed attempts, false starts, experiments that did not quite work. The Maiden Pyramid, whose outer casing collapsed, possibly during construction, leaving the ghostly tower of inner core that still stands today, surrounded by a vast apron of rubble. The Bent Pyramid at Dashur, whose builders changed the angle of the sides partway through construction, perhaps because the original angle was too steep and the structure was showing signs of instability, resulting in a shape that is, from a distance, oddly graceful, almost organic, as though the pyramid is tired and has settled itself slightly. The Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, Sneferu's great experimental success, a true pyramid with straight sides at a shallow angle, the first time the form was achieved successfully. And then Giza. Then the 4th dynasty, around 2560 BCE, the reign of the pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, and the building of the Great Pyramid. There are statistics associated with the Great Pyramid of Giza that are frequently cited and that are genuinely staggering. Its original height of nearly 150 meters. Its base covering over 53,000 square meters. The approximately 2.5 million stone blocks used in its construction, with an average weight of 2.5 tons each, and some weighing considerably more. The precision of its alignment to the cardinal directions, accurate to within a fraction of a degree. The flatness of its base, leveled to within 2 centimeters across its entire extent. These are extraordinary achievements, and they speak to the organizational and technical mastery of the builders in ways that scholars are still debating and exploring. But statistics are not what the Great Pyramid gives you when you stand before it. Statistics are what you read about before you go, and they prepare you intellectually but not emotionally for the experience of actually being there, actually standing at the base of this thing and looking up at it, letting your eyes travel up its surface toward the point where it meets the sky. What the Great Pyramid gives you, what it has always given every person who has ever stood before it, from the Egyptian farmers who built it, to the Greek travelers who came to marvel at it, to the Arab scholars who measured it, to the Napoleonic soldiers who looked up at it in the Egyptian sun, is a feeling. A particular, unmistakable, almost physical feeling that is something like awe and something like vertigo and something like the recognition of your own smallness, not in a defeating way but in an expanding way, the way you feel small in front of the ocean or small under a night sky full of stars. Imagine walking toward the Great Pyramid in the hours just before midnight. The Egyptian night in the desert outside Cairo is cool, almost cold in the deep hours before dawn, and the air carries that particular desert clarity that makes the stars look close enough to touch. The plateau at Giza is lit by moonlight, and the pyramids cast long shadows across the pale limestone ground. Shadows so dark they look solid, look like darker versions of the pyramids themselves laid flat on the earth. The Great Pyramid rises before you as you approach, growing and growing as you walk toward it, refusing to stay at the size your eyes expect it to be at this distance, insisting on being larger, always larger than your perception can quite accommodate. At its base, the stones are enormous. The lowest courses of the pyramid use the largest blocks, some of them 2 and 3 meters in height, and standing beside them in the moonlight, you feel something shift in your sense of scale. Feel yourself recalibrate to a new and humbling size. You reach out and touch the surface of the stone. The old casing stones are gone now, stripped away in the medieval period for building material. But the core stones beneath are rough and heavily textured. Not the smooth gleaming surface the pyramid once had, but something rawer and in some ways more intimate, more touchable, more real. The stone is cool under your hand. It is always cool even in the heat of the day, because stone absorbs and releases heat slowly on geological timescales that have nothing to do with the daily drama of the Egyptian sun. The coolness of the stone at night is one of the things that visitors to the pyramids always mention. It surprises them. They expect something inert, something dead, something merely massive. They do not expect this quality of the stone, this sense of it holding something, storing something, as though all the heat of the days and years and centuries it has absorbed and slowly released has left a kind of memory in it, a thermal history written in the crystal lattice of the limestone itself. You press your palm flat against the stone and feel this coolness seeping into your hand, and you think distantly about all the other hands that have touched this stone, about the workers who placed this block, and the priests who consecrated it, and the robbers who searched for treasure in its passages, and the scholars who measured and mapped it, and the tourists who photographed it, and you feel the stone's indifference to all of them, its serene and stony continuity through every one of those moments. Around you, the plateau is silent. The sounds of Cairo, never entirely absent, are muffled by distance and by the windless air of the night, reduced to a low, barely audible hum, like the city breathing in its sleep. Closer there is nothing, just the faint scratch of sand grains shifted by the small breeze that comes and goes. Just the distant, irregular barking of dogs somewhere in the village at the edge of the plateau. Just, if you are very quiet and very still, the sound of your own breathing, which sounds louder out here than it does anywhere else, which reminds you that you are alive and moving and temporary in a way that the stones around you simply are not. The Sphinx is there, to the east of the pyramids, and in the moonlight it is something that daylight does not quite capture. In daylight, the Sphinx is a monument. In moonlight, it is almost a presence. The great stone face, eroded by millennia of wind and sand and the occasional rain, looks out over the desert with an expression that has been debated endlessly, and probably means nothing more than the limitations of the sculptor's art and the particular qualities of the limestone from which it was carved, but that in the moonlight seems to carry something that you cannot quite name, a kind of gravity, a kind of attention, as though whatever the Sphinx is looking at, it has been looking at it for a very long time and has not yet seen enough. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was not built by slaves. This is a misconception so entrenched that it is worth addressing directly and firmly. It was built by skilled and unskilled workers who were Egyptian citizens, who were paid in food and housing and medical care, who were buried with honor near the pyramids when they died of the injuries and diseases that this punishing work inevitably produced. The workers' village at Giza, excavated by the archaeologist Mark Lehner beginning in the 1980s, gives us an extraordinary picture of the community that built the pyramids. They ate beef and fish. They drank beer, the staple beverage of ancient Egypt, more nutritious and safer than water, and consumed in quantities that would astonish most modern drinkers. They received medical treatment for their injuries, and the healed fractures found in their skeletons tell a story of both the danger of their work and the sophistication of the care they received. They were not slaves. They were Egyptians building something for Egypt, for the divine pharaoh who embodied Egypt, and they understood their work in these terms. The organization of the pyramid building project was a masterpiece of administrative complexity. Workers were organized into gangs, each with a name: the Companions of Khufu or the Friends of Khufu, names that suggest a sense of identity and belonging that went beyond mere labor. These gangs were subdivided into smaller units called files, from the Greek word for tribe, and within the files into even smaller working groups. Each level of this hierarchy had its own foreman and its own set of records. The administrative apparatus that tracked this work was enormous, and the papyri found at Wadi El Jarf, a harbour on the Red Sea that was used to supply the Giza Plateau with copper tools and food, give us a direct glimpse into the bureaucratic reality of the pyramid building project in a way that is both fascinating and oddly mundane. Inspector Morer, whose name appears on some of these documents, kept careful records of his team's work transporting limestone from the quarries at Tura across the Nile to Giza, recording each day's work with a thoroughness that would not be out of place in a modern project management system. The two other pyramids at Giza belong to Khufu's son Khafre and his grandson Menkore. Khafre's pyramid is slightly smaller than Khufu's in absolute terms, but appears taller because it was built on higher ground and has retained some of its original smooth Tura limestone casing near its apex, giving a ghostly impression of what the pyramids originally looked like, gleaming white under the sun. Menkare's pyramid is significantly smaller than either of the other two, and there are various theories about why this might be, ranging from a change in the allocation of royal resources to a deliberate artistic choice about proportion in relation to the larger complex. Whatever the reason, the three pyramids together form a composition that has been observed and admired and analyzed for thousands of years, and that still has the power, in certain lights and from certain angles, to take your breath away. The valley temples that stand at the base of the plateau, connected to the pyramids by long causeways, are places of extraordinary atmosphere. Khafre's Valley Temple, built of massive blocks of red granite and alabaster, is one of the best preserved of these structures, and inside it, the quality of the light and the weight of the stone create something close to the feeling of entering a sacred space in the modern sense. A place where the air itself seems heavier, with significance, where you lower your voice without quite knowing why. Beyond the Great Pyramids, the city of the dead that surrounds them extends for miles in every direction. The mastabas are the nobles and officials who serve the Old Kingdom pharaohs line the plateau in neat rows, their plain exteriors concealing elaborately decorated interior chapels where the scenes of daily life that they show are among the most vivid and informative records of the ancient world. These are the tombs of the people who made Egypt work, the officials and scribes and priests and craftsmen, whose names are sometimes known to us and sometimes not, but whose faces and occupations and small domestic details are preserved in the painted limestone reliefs of their tomb chapels with a vividness and a warmth that crosses every cultural and temporal boundary to reach us directly. Here is a man fishing from a papyrus skiff in a thicket of reeds while his wife and daughter sit beside him, the daughter holding a flower. Here is a baker kneading dough in a large ceramic vessel while the bread loaves cool on a rack beside him and a cat waits patiently under the table. Here is a group of musicians, a harpist and a flute player, and a singer with her hand raised in a characteristic gesture, performing at a banquet while the guests drink from tall jars. Here are cattle being counted by scribes who write their numbers on small tablets, and here are fishermen pulling in a net heavy with fish, and here are children playing games on the rooftop of a mud brick house while their parents sit in the shade below. These scenes are not merely decorative, they are functional, magical acts, ensuring that the dead person in the tomb would have the benefit of all these activities in the afterlife. But their incidental effect is to preserve for us, across 4,500 years, the texture of daily life along the Nile with an intimacy and a specificity that no other ancient civilization has left us. The daily life of ordinary Egyptians along the Nile was organized by the rhythms of the river and the rhythms of the sun, two great cycles that governed everything. The day began at dawn, which in Egypt is an event. The light comes up quickly in the desert. None of the long grey dawns of northern latitudes, and within minutes of first light, the world is flooded with a warm golden illumination that turns the Nile to bronze and makes the eastern cliffs glow like iron in a forge. People were up before this. The farmers heading to their fields, the fishermen launching their boats, the women grinding grain and lighting the cooking fires, the artisans beginning their work in the workshops attached to the great estates and temples that were the organizing institutions of Egyptian economic life. The Egyptian diet was built around bread and beer, with these two staples supplemented by fish from the Nile, vegetables grown in the gardens along the riverbank, fruits from the date palms and the doom palms and the fig trees, and on special occasions, the meat of cattle or goats or the wildfowl that could be netted or hunted in the marshes. The bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, ground on stone saddle querns in a process that was laborious and that inevitably introduced grit from the millstone into the flour, with the result that the teeth of even young Egyptians were heavily worn. Ground flat by a lifetime of eating bread that was slightly abrasive. The beer was made from partially baked bread soaked in water and allowed to ferment, a thick, nutritious, slightly sour liquid that was consumed by everyone, children and adults, workers and nobles, priests and farmers, in enormous quantities. It was, quite simply, the primary caloric supplement to bread, a liquid food as much as a beverage. The houses of ordinary Egyptians were built of mud brick, a material that was perfectly suited to the Egyptian environment. Mud brick is cheap. It is cool in summer and warm in winter. It requires only basic skill to produce and lay, and it is available in unlimited quantities along the banks of a river whose annual flooding deposits fresh silt every year. The mud was mixed with chopped straw and sometimes with animal dung, shaped in wooden molds, and dried in the sun, which in Egypt takes almost no time at all. The houses were simple in plan, typically 1 or 2 rooms, with a flat roof that served as an extension of the living space in the cool evenings, where families might sleep in summer to escape the heat that accumulated in the rooms below. These houses were not bare. They were plastered inside and painted in bright colors, sometimes with simple geometric patterns and sometimes with more elaborate scenes. Furniture was minimal, but often of fine quality. Low beds with woven mattresses and carved wooden headrests that kept the hair from being crushed, and the sleeper's head elevated above the insects that moved across the floor at night. Chairs with woven rush seats, small wooden tables, 2 pottery storage jars containing grain and oil and dried fish and the ingredients for beer. On the walls, perhaps a small painted image of a god or a protective spirit, a household deity whose image could be appealed to in moments of trouble or in gratitude for good fortune. The Egyptians were not an austere people. They loved beauty in their homes and on their bodies and in their gardens. They wore white linen, the material produced from the flax that grew abundantly along the Nile, woven in workshops attached to the great estates and produced in quantities that supplied everyone from the pharaoh to the farm laborer. The linen of the wealthy was of an extraordinary fineness, practically transparent, a textile achievement that rivals the finest fabrics produced anywhere in the ancient world. Both men and women wore makeup, the black coal eyeliner that we associate with Egyptian art being not merely decorative, but practical, since it reduced the glare of the sun reflected off the desert sand and the water of the Nile, and may have had antiseptic properties that helped protect the eyes from the infections that were common in a riparian environment. They made jewelry of gold and carnelian and lapis lazuli, and cheaper imitations of these materials in faience, the beautiful blue-green glaze that is one of the most characteristic and lovely of Egyptian artistic media. They wore perfumed oils and scented fats in their hair. They gardened with an attention and an affection that is visible in the tomb paintings, where every tree and flower is rendered with botanical accuracy and obvious fondness. They played music, they danced, they told stories. They played board games, the game of sonnet being particularly popular, a racing game whose pieces have been found in tombs from the earliest periods of Egyptian history. They held festivals that were occasions for great communal celebration, with processions and feasting and music and the drinking of large quantities of beer and wine. The festivals of Egypt were numerous and varied, tied to the agricultural calendar and to the mythological narratives that gave meaning to the cycle of the year. The Orpet Festival at Luxor was one of the greatest, a month-long celebration in which the cult statue of Ammon was transported in procession from his temple at Karnak to the temple at Luxor and back, accompanied by priests and musicians and dancers and vast crowds of ordinary people who lined the route to catch a glimpse of the god's portable shrine as it passed. The beautiful Festival of the Valley was another great occasion when the deity crossed from the east bank to the west bank of the Nile, the living crossing to visit the dead, the gods of the East, making their annual pilgrimage to the necropolis of Thebes. These were not solemn occasions. They were joyful, exuberant, sometimes even raucous celebrations that lasted for days or weeks and provided the ordinary Egyptian with a break from the grinding routine of agricultural labor and a direct encounter with the sacred. The beer flowed freely at these festivals. The food was distributed to the people from the temple stalls. The music was loud and the dancing was vigorous, and the ordinary distance between the human and the divine was temporarily dissolved, or at least felt to be dissolved, and people went home from these festivals with their sense of meaning and belonging and cosmic connection refreshed. The papyrus reed, which grew in dense stands at the water's edge along the entire length of the Nile, was one of the most versatile and important natural resources available to the ancient Egyptians. From papyrus they made their writing material, cutting the pith of the stem into thin strips, laying them in overlapping layers, and pressing and beating them until they bonded together into a smooth, flexible sheet that could be written on with reed pen and carbon ink. They made their small boats from bundles of papyrus stems bound tightly together, boats that were surprisingly seaworthy and that are depicted in tomb paintings gliding through the papyrus thickets in scenes of hunting and fishing. They made sandals and baskets and mats from the stems and leaves. They ate the young shoots as a vegetable. They burned the dried stalks as fuel. The papyrus plant, with its tall stem and its extraordinary head of thin radiating fibers, became one of the symbols of Lower Egypt and appeared throughout Egyptian art as a hieroglyph, as an architectural column, as a painted motif on the walls of temples and palaces. The breweries of ancient Egypt were substantial industrial operations, producing the beer that was simultaneously a food, a beverage, a currency, and an offering to the gods in quantities that are difficult to overestimate. Archaeological evidence from the workers' settlement at Giza suggests a brewing operation capable of producing tens of thousands of liters of beer per day during the period of active pyramid construction, enough to supply the thousands of workers on the plateau with their daily ration. The brewery at Tel Amarna, excavated in the 20th century, gives us detailed information about the process, with large ceramic vats for mashing and fermenting, grain storage facilities, and the remains of the pottery in which the beer was distributed to its consumers. Beer was poured as offerings in tombs and temples. Beer jugs were depicted in offering lists alongside bread and meat and linen. Beer was given as wages to workers and as payments to craftsmen and as gifts between neighbors to neighbors. The first breweries of Egypt are among the oldest evidence of industrial food production in human history, and they speak to something fundamental about the relationship between the Nile and the civilization it nourished. The Nile provided the grain from which the beer was made. The Nile provided the water in which the grain was mashed. The Nile's annual flooding was itself sometimes described in terms that evoked intoxication, the overflowing abundance of the inundation compared to the overflowing abundance of a beer jar. The connection between the river's fertility and the human experience of nourishment and pleasure was not merely metaphorical, it was metabolic. The Nile entered the body of every Egyptian through every drink of water and every mouthful of bread and every jar of beer and every bite of the fish pulled from its waters. And in this way, the river was not merely the setting of Egyptian civilization, but its substance, the material of which its people were quite literally made. To the west of the modern city of Luxor, on the other side of the Nile from the great temples that line the eastern bank, there is a landscape that looks, in the right light and at the right time of day, like nothing so much as the surface of another world. The cliffs are pale limestone, smoothed and eroded by wind into forms that seem to suggest enormous faces, enormous gestures, enormous precedents to geological matter. The valleys that cut back into these cliffs twist and turn in ways that make it easy to lose your sense of direction, easy to find yourself suddenly uncertain of which way leads back to the river, which way leads further into the stone. The light in the late afternoon turns these cliffs to gold and orange, and finally to a deep burning amber. And the shadows in the valley floors go dark early, hours before the sun sets over the western desert, giving the valleys a premature night that is, in its way, entirely appropriate. This is the Valley of the Kings. The ancient Egyptians called it Ta Seket Ma'at, the Field of Reeds, or more commonly they referred to the area around it as Ta Set-at, the Great Place. It is neither a single valley nor a particularly obvious location. The entrance to the main valley is not dramatic. There is no natural gateway, no triumphal arch of rock to mark the transition from the ordinary world to the place of royal burial. You turn a bend in the road and you are simply there, in a bowl of white and ochre cliffs that surround you on three sides, and above you the triangular peak of the mountain called Al-Khan, the Horn, which the Egyptians saw as a natural pyramid, a pyramid built by the gods themselves, presiding over the sacred ground below. The Valley of the Kings was in use as a royal burial ground for roughly 500 years, from the beginning of the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE to the end of the 20th dynasty around 1070 BCE. During this period, the tombs of 63 pharaohs and various nobles and royal family members were cut deep into the limestone cliffs, their entrances concealed by the rubble of the cutting process, their shafts and corridors and chambers descending into the cool rock with a complexity and an elaborateness that increased over the centuries as the resources available to the royal workshops grew and as the theological understanding of what was needed for a successful royal afterlife became more elaborate. The decision to abandon the pyramid as the royal burial monument and to move to the hidden rock-cut tomb was almost certainly driven by the security problem that the pyramids had made so painfully obvious. Despite every precaution, every granite portcullis and sealed shaft and false corridor, the pyramids had been robbed, all of them, of their contents, sometimes within decades of the original burial. The pyramid advertised its location and its contents in the most dramatic possible way, and no amount of architectural cleverness could prevent determined and resourceful thieves from eventually finding their way inside. The rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings were intended to be invisible, to vanish under the rubble of their own construction, to present to the world nothing but a smooth cliff face with no obvious indication of what lay beneath it. The strategy did not work. Every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few centuries of the original burial, but the effort to conceal them is itself instructive about the Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife. The hidden tomb was a kind of magic as much as a security measure. It was built to be invisible, not just to tomb robbers, but to the forces of chaos, to everything that might threaten the dead king's peaceful existence in the next world. The tomb was a microcosm, a small world in itself, containing everything the king needed, physically and spiritually, for the journey through the afterlife and for his eventual emergence into the eternal life of the blessed dead. Its hiddenness was part of its protective function, part of the magic that kept the dead king safe. The interior of a Valley of the King's tomb is, when you first enter it, a revelation. The heat of the Egyptian sun follows you in through the entrance for only a short distance. Within a few meters, the temperature drops to something cool and constant and slightly damp. The temperature of the rock itself, which maintains a year-round equanimity utterly indifferent to the drama of seasons and solar cycles happening at the surface. The air has a particular quality, dry and slightly mineral, with perhaps the faintest trace of something organic, something that is the memory of the resin-soaked wrappings and the aromatic oils and the food offerings that once filled these spaces. It is an air that feels old, not stale exactly, but ancient, as though it has been breathed before by people who moved through these passages on very different errands than the one that brings you here. The corridors descend. They are not always straight. They turn and step and drop and sometimes open into small antechambers before continuing their descent. The walls and ceilings are covered, in the tombs of the major pharaohs of the New Kingdom, in painted relief, the paint still extraordinarily bright in the cool, stable conditions of the tomb interior, the colors fresh and vivid in a way that makes you think, absurdly but persistently, that the painter has just left the room. Blue and red and gold and green and black and white, the colors of the Egyptian palette, applied to the plaster-coated limestone with a skill and a confidence that is breathtaking even in the half-light of modern electric illumination. The texts and images on these tomb walls are not decorative. They are functional. They are maps, instruction manuals, magical texts, ritual formulas, every one of them serving the purpose of helping the dead king navigate the dangers of the afterlife and arrive safely at his destination among the gods. The Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, follows the sun god Ra on his nightly journey through the 12 hours of the night, through the darkness of the Duat, past the enemies who would destroy him, and with his eventual, triumphant rebirth at dawn. The Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Earth, the Litany of Ra. Each of these compositions encodes a slightly different understanding of the afterlife journey, a slightly different map of the underworld, a slightly different set of magical protections for the king's soul. The sheer quantity and variety of these texts tells us that the Egyptians were not dogmatic about their theology in the way that later monotheistic religions would be. They could hold multiple, sometimes contradictory versions of the afterlife narrative simultaneously, understanding that the truth of spiritual experience is too large and too complex to be captured in any single account. The Valley of the Kings is not silent. During the day, when the tourist buses are arriving and the guides are speaking and the workers are maintaining the pathways between the tomb entrances, it is busy and vocal and entirely of the present world. But early in the morning, before the site opens, or in the brief moments when the crowds thin and a space of quiet opens up, you can hear the valley's own sounds, the wind moving over the cliff tops, creating a low, hollow sound in the narrow clefts in the rock. The occasional small stone dislodged by the thermal expansion of the limestone as the morning sun hits it, falling with a sharp crack that echoes off the cliff faces. Perhaps the call of a bird high above on the ridge, its voice descending into the valley floor. The pharaohs who are buried here are the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, and they are the pharaohs whose names are most familiar to us, the pharaohs whose deeds and whose monuments define the popular image of ancient Egypt. Thutmose I, who first chose this valley as a royal burial ground, Thutmose III, the military genius who expanded Egypt's empire to its greatest extent, Amenhotep III, the Magnificent, in whose reign Egypt was wealthier and more internationally connected than it had ever been, Seti I, whose tomb is perhaps the most beautifully decorated of all the royal tombs in the valley, and Ramses II, Ramses the Great, the most celebrated and most prolific builder in Egyptian history, whose name and face appear on more monuments than any other pharaoh, and whose image is perhaps the most immediately recognizable face in the ancient world. To understand Ramses II, you need to understand first the context in which he operated. He came to power around 1279 BCE, inheriting the throne from his father Seti I, and he would go on to reign for 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. By the time he died, Probably in his 90s, he had outlived most of his sons and had become something close to a legend in his own lifetime. A pharaoh who had ruled so long and built so much and celebrated himself so elaborately that the distinction between the historical man and the mythological figure was already dissolving during his own reign. The Great Temple at Abu Simbel, built during Ramses II's reign in the far south of Egypt near the border with Nubia, is the most audacious and the most personal monument in Egyptian history. It is not a state monument in the way that Karnak is a state monument, not a gift to a god in the way that the Temple of Luxor is a gift to Amun. It is, with a directness that is almost shocking, a temple built by Ramses II to Ramses II, a monument in which the pharaoh presents himself to his subjects and to the gods and to the ages as himself divine, himself an object of worship, himself a being of cosmic significance equal to the gods whose company he claims to share. The facade of the Great Temple at Abu Simbel is dominated by 4 colossal seated statues of Ramses II, each approximately 20 meters tall, cut directly from the living rock of the cliff face. The scale of these figures is extraordinary even by the standards of Egyptian monumental sculpture. You understand intellectually that they are large, and then you walk toward them and they are larger than you understood, and then you stand at their feet and they are larger still, their faces looming above you against the sky at an angle that forces you to tilt your head back and keep tilting it, their expressions carved with an idealized calm that has the quality of weather rather than human emotion, looking out over the Nile Valley in a gaze that has covered the same ground for more than 3,000 years. The interior of the Great Temple is a sequence of halls cut progressively deeper into the rock, each one smaller and darker than the last, drawing you inward toward the innermost sanctuary where the cult statues sit in permanent darkness. 4 statues in the sanctuary, Ra-Horakhtai, Amun-Ra, and Ptah, the 3 great state gods, and Ramses II himself, seated in their company as an equal, as a divine being in his own right. Twice a year, at the dates that fall on the anniversary of Ramses' coronation and of his birthday, the rising sun sends a beam of light directly through the temple entrance, down through the great hall and the vestibule, and into the inner sanctuary, illuminating 3 of the 4 statues in the golden light of the Egyptian dawn. The 4th statue, Ptah, the god of darkness and creation, remains always in shadow. This solar alignment is one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in the ancient world, and the precision with which it has been maintained for 3,000 years, even after the temple was moved in its entirety 54 meters up the cliff face in the 1960s to save it from the rising waters of Lake Nasser, speaks to the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Egyptian architects who planned it. The walls of the Great Temple's interior are covered in scenes of Ramses' military campaigns, dominated by the great cycle of reliefs depicting the Battle of Kadesh, the engagement between Egyptian and Hittite forces at the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in modern Syria in 1274 BCE. The battle was, in historical reality, a military draw, neither side achieving a decisive victory, with the result that Ramses and the Hittite king Hattusili III eventually signed a peace treaty that is the oldest surviving formal treaty between 2 major powers in human history. But the way Ramses presented this inconclusive engagement on the walls of his temples was as a personal triumph of almost supernatural magnitude. The reliefs show him in his war chariot, alone against the master Hittite forces, his horse charging forward while the enemy falls beneath him in panic and confusion. A single hero against an army, saved by his own divine power and the intervention of Amun-Ra. This version of events was, of course, propaganda of the most brazen kind. But it was also, in a deeper sense, something more than propaganda. It was a mythological statement, the pharaoh standing alone against chaos, driving back the forces of disorder by the power of Ma'at, by the divine energy that resided in his person, was not merely a political image. It was a theological proposition about the nature of kingship and its role in maintaining the cosmic order. Every battle that the pharaoh fought in the Egyptian theological worldview was a recapitulation of the primordial battle between order and chaos, between the gods and the forces of disorder that threatened to undo the creation. Ramses at Kadesh was not just a general in a difficult military situation, he was a cosmic principle embodying the victory of order over chaos for the 10,000th time. The small temple at Abu Simbel, built alongside the Great Temple, is dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Ramses' chief wife Nefertari, and it is in some ways the more moving of the two structures. Its facade shows alternating colossal figures of Ramses and Nefertari, and the equality implied by this arrangement, the fact that the chief queen is shown at the same scale as the pharaoh, a virtually unprecedented distinction, speaks to something genuine about the relationship between this particular pair, something that goes beyond the usual formal representations of royal consorts as smaller, subordinate figures. Nefertari was evidently a woman of great intelligence and political skill. She conducted her own diplomatic correspondence with the Hittite queen, sending gifts and letters that survive in the Hittite archives and that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic protocols of the ancient Near East. Ramses addressed her in inscriptions with a tenderness unusual in official Egyptian texts, calling her the one for whom the sun shines. Moving backward in time from Ramses II brings us to one of the most remarkable and most enigmatic figures in Egyptian history, the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt for approximately 22 years in the early 18th dynasty, around 1473 to 1458 BCE. Hatshepsut's story is extraordinary even by the extraordinary standards of ancient Egypt. She began her career as regent for her stepson and nephew Thutmose III, who was still a child when his father Thutmose II died. At some point during her regency, she made the decision to take the full title and role of pharaoh, not merely queen regent or great royal wife, but pharaoh, king, with all the titles and iconography and authority that the position entailed. She wore the false beard of kingship. She wore the double crown. She was depicted in statues as a male pharaoh with the idealized, calm, slightly androgynous face that was the conventional form for royal portraiture. And she ruled, apparently, with great effectiveness and considerable success. What we know of Hatshepsut's reign suggests a period of peace and prosperity and significant architectural achievement. A mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, the temple she called Djiza-Djizaru, the Holy of Holies, is one of the most beautiful buildings in Egypt, a three-tiered structure of colonnaded porticos rising against the natural backdrop of the Theban cliffs with a harmony and an elegance that seems to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. The architect was Senemat, her chief steward and possibly her lover, a man of extraordinary gifts whose rise from obscure origins to the highest position of trust in the kingdom is one of the most remarkable careers in Egyptian history, and has attracted nearly as much speculation as the queen he served. The walls of Djiza-Djizaru contain some of the most vivid narrative scenes in Egyptian art, including the extended cycle of reliefs depicting Hatshepsut's great trading expedition to the land of Punt. Punt was a place of fabulous wealth in the Egyptian imagination, a source of incense and myrrh and ebony and gold and animals of exotic species, located somewhere in the region of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea or Djibouti, accessible from Egypt by sea via the Red Sea via the Red Sea. Egyptian expeditions had reached Punt before Hatshepsut's time, but she sent the most famous and most elaborately documented expedition, and the reliefs in her temple at Deir el-Bahri tell its story with a specificity and a vividness that is unlike anything else in Egyptian monumental art. The expedition set out from the Red Sea coast, the ships loaded with trade goods, the sailors and soldiers and traders aboard them, setting out across an ocean that was not well known and that was, by any reasonable standard, genuinely dangerous. The Red Sea is a demanding body of water. Its winds are contrary and unpredictable. Its coral reefs are treacherous, its narrow passages require careful navigation, and the heat that beats down on it for most of the year makes the experience of crossing it in an ancient wooden vessel a genuine test of endurance. But the lure of Punt was sufficient. The goods that came back from Punt, the frankincense and myrrh and precious resins that were burned in the temples and used in the mummification process and consumed as perfume and medicine, were worth any amount of effort and risk. The release at Deir al-Bahari show the arrival of the Egyptian fleet at Punt with a wonderful specificity of detail. The Puntite chief comes down to meet the Egyptians, and beside him stands his wife, a remarkable woman depicted in the release with a body that shows the signs of a medical condition, probably lipodystrophy, that the ancient Egyptian artist has rendered with a clinical accuracy that speaks to the Egyptian tendency toward direct visual observation rather than idealization in their depictions of foreigners. The trees of Punt are shown in the background, their round, distinctive forms rendered with botanical accuracy, and among them the artist has shown a village of beehive-shaped huts raised on poles above the ground, a housing type still used in parts of East Africa. The scent of the place comes to you through the images, the heavy, resinous smell of frankincense burning in the morning air, the salt of the sea, the particular quality of the light over the Red Sea coast in the early morning when the air is still cool and the water is a deep, dark blue. The return of the expedition is shown with equal detail. The ships are loaded with their precious cargo, the myrrh trees being transported living in pots of soil so that they can be transplanted to grow in Egypt, a logistical challenge of considerable difficulty. There are frankincense resin and ebony logs and living animals, dogs and monkeys, and the giraffe, whose great height is indicated by the Egyptian artist with a charming literalism that requires the animal to be shown at a different scale from the humans around it. The expedition has been a success, and the goods from Punt will be offered to Amun at Karnak in a great ceremony that Hatshepsut will use to demonstrate both her piety and her political effectiveness, her ability to bring the wealth of the far world to the service of Egypt's gods. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III, her stepson and co-regent, undertook a systematic campaign to erase her from history. Her images were hacked from the walls of her temples. Her name was removed from inscriptions and replaced with that of her father, Thutmose I, or of Thutmose II or Threed. Her statues were broken and buried in a pit near her temple. For 3,000 years, this erasure was largely successful. 19th century scholars who noticed the occasional appearance of a female pharaoh in the records assume she must have been a wicked queen regent who had usurped power illegitimately, because the assumption that a woman could be pharaoh was simply not one that the Victorian imagination could accommodate without reaching for a narrative of villainy. It was only in the 20th century, particularly through the work of scholars like Herbert Winlock and later James Henry Breasted, that the scale and the success of Hatshepsut's reign became fully apparent, and that the figure of the female pharaoh was recovered from the damage that the Thutmose III had done to her memory. Why did Thutmose III erase her? The simplest explanation is political. A female pharaoh was an anomaly, a disruption of the expected succession narrative, and her erasure from the record was an attempt to smooth the official history of the 18th dynasty back into the expected pattern of male succession. There is also the personal dimension. Thutmose III spent the years of Hatshepsut's reign as a junior partner in a co-regency that clearly privileged her. His patience during those years may have curdled into resentment. Or perhaps the erasure was not about Thutmose III at all, but was the work of his successor, Amenhotep II, who had stronger reasons to want the anomaly of a female pharaoh removed from the official record. The question is not fully resolved and probably cannot be. What we can say is that the attempt at erasure failed, ultimately because the stone was too hard and the work was too rushed, and the shadows of her carved images and the ghosts of her erased name and the buried but not destroyed statues have given her back to us across 3,500 years, more or less intact. The 18th dynasty that Hatshepsut ruled so brilliantly is the dynasty that contains perhaps the most discussed and most debated figure in all of Egyptian history. In the 14th century BCE, around 1353 to 1336 BCE, a pharaoh ascended to the throne who would tear apart the fabric of Egyptian religious life and attempt to replace the entire complex of Egyptian theology with a single, radical, unprecedented idea. His name at birth was Amenhotep IV. His name, as he would rename himself, was Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and his idea was that there was only one god. The Aten, the sun disk, had been a minor deity in the Egyptian pantheon before Akhenaten's time, one of several solar deities in a tradition rich with solar theology. But Akhenaten elevated the Aten to supremacy, and then beyond supremacy to exclusivity. In the early years of his reign, he declared that the Aten was not merely the greatest of the gods, but the only god, that the traditional gods of Egypt, Amun and Ra and Osiris and Isis and Horus and all the rest, did not exist, that their names should be erased from the monuments, that their temples should be closed, that the enormous priestly establishment that had accumulated around them should be disbanded, that all the accumulated theology and mythology that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 2,000 years should simply be set aside. The audacity of this program is difficult to overstate. It was not a gradual religious reform. It was a revolution, immediate and absolute, imposed from above by the power of a pharaoh who believed, apparently with complete sincerity, that he was acting on direct divine instruction. Akhenaten did not simply suppress the old religion. He built a new city to house the new religion, a city on a virgin site in Middle Egypt, midway between the old capitals of Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south, on a stretch of desert cliffs on the east bank of the Nile that had no previous settlement and no previous sacred associations. He called this city Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, the place where the sun rises, and today it is known as Tel El Amarna, or simply Amarna. Amarna was built with extraordinary speed, rising from nothing to a functioning royal capital within a few years. The main city stretched for several miles along the Nile's east bank, its royal road running the length of the settlement with the king's palace on one side and the great temple of the Aten on the other. The great temple was unlike any Egyptian temple before it, because the Aten, as a deity represented by the physical sun disk and by sunlight itself, could not be housed in the dark inner sanctuaries of the traditional Egyptian temple. The Aten's worship required open sky, required direct sunlight, required a different kind of sacred space, and the great temple at Amarna was accordingly a series of open courts under the sky, with dozens of offering tables where the rituals of worship were performed in the full light of the sun. The art of the Amarna period is one of the most startling and most debated phenomena in the history of art. The conventional forms of Egyptian art, developed over 2,000 years and so firmly established that they amount to a visual language with its own grammar, are suddenly and dramatically changed. The stiff, formal, idealized figures of the conventional tradition are replaced by figures that are longer, stranger, more fluid, with elongated skulls and heavy lips and prominent bellies and thighs, a physical type that has been interpreted in a dozen different ways by scholars. Is it a genuine attempt at naturalistic representation? Is it a stylized distortion intended to convey the divine strangeness of the pharaoh's body? Is it a reflection of some actual physical condition that Akhenaten suffered? The answer is probably some combination of these things, but whatever its origin, the Amarna artistic style creates images of extraordinary strangeness and power, images that break so completely with what came before that they feel, even now, like a disruption, like an intrusion of something genuinely new. Among these images, none is more famous and more resonant than the representations of Nefertiti, Akhenaten's great royal wife, whose famous painted limestone bust, now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, is one of the most recognized images in all of art. Nefertiti in this image wears her distinctive flat-topped crown, blue and banded, and her face, for all its idealization, has a quality of individual presence that no other ancient Egyptian portrait quite achieves. She looks slightly to one side with an expression of complete composure, not quite a smile, not a smile, that has kept people looking at her face for exactly the same reason that people keep looking at the Mona Lisa, because there is something in it that cannot be fully resolved, a depth behind the surface that retreats as you approach it. Nefertiti is depicted in Amarna art in ways that are unprecedented for an Egyptian queen. She appears on the same scale as the king. She is shown performing ritual acts that had previously been exclusively the province of the pharaoh. smiting enemies, adoring the Aten, making offerings in the great temple. In some images she appears wearing the double crown of Egypt, the crown of a pharaoh. It seems clear that she was, in the Amarna court, something far beyond the role of a conventional chief wife, something closer to a co-ruler, a partner in the great religious experiment that Akhenaten was conducting. Whether this represented genuine shared power or was primarily a theological statement about the divine couple as the earthly representatives of the Aten and the divine world remains a matter of scholarly debate. The city of Amarna was inhabited for perhaps 17 years. When Akhenaten died, the religious revolution he had attempted died with him. His successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, whose original name was Tutankhaten, restored the traditional religion, reopened the temples, reinstated the priesthoods, and moved the court back to the traditional capitals. Amarna was abandoned, its population dispersed to Memphis and Thebes and the other cities of Egypt. The temples were dismantled, their stones reused in building projects elsewhere. The city returned to the desert from which it had been so hastily built, its mud brick houses dissolving slowly back into the earth, its streets filling with sand, its royal road buried under the drift of the desert that is always in Egypt, waiting to reclaim whatever has been cleared from it. What was left was silence and the slow dissolution of the extraordinary experiment that had happened here. And then, gradually, something else happened. The tombs in the desert cliffs around Amarna, the tombs that Akhenaten had cut for his nobles and his officials in the same limestone that contained the boundary stele marking the limits of the sacred city, began to fill with sand, sealing their decorated walls from the air. And in the houses of the city, under the accumulation of centuries of wind-blown deposit, the evidence of the lives lived there was being slowly preserved. The clay tablets of the Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian court and the kings of Babylon and Assyria, and the city-states of Canaan, lying in the ruins of the Foreign Office building, the floor plans of the palaces and the workshops and the ordinary houses preserved in the outlines of their mud brick foundations, the small household objects, the pottery and the glass and the faience amulets and the limestone figurines that tell us who lived here and how they lived their lives during the strange, brief, blazing lifetime of Akhenaten's sun-disk city. Among the kings who are buried in the Valley of the Kings, the one whose tomb has become the most famous is not one of the great conquerors or builders or long-lived rulers. It is a boy who died before his 20th birthday, who reigned for less than a decade, who left no great military victories or architectural achievements to his name, who was, by the standards of Egyptian royal accomplishment, a minor figure. But the fact that his tomb was left undisturbed while every other royal tomb in the valley was looted means that Tutankhamun, the boy king, the son of Akhenaten, has become the most famous of all the pharaohs. His name known to every child in the modern world. His golden mask, one of the most immediately recognized images in human culture. We will come back to Tutankhamun's discovery, but first we must walk deeper into the Egyptian world, into the realm that was more important to the ancient Egyptians than any earthly kingdom, the realm of the gods and the dead, the realm of myth and magic that lay beneath and around and within the physical world of the Nile. There is a text that was written on papyrus and on coffin lids and on the walls of burial chambers and on the wrappings of mummies. A text that has survived in hundreds of versions and has been copied by scribes and carved by craftsmen and painted by artists across more than 1,000 years of Egyptian history. We call it the Book of the Dead, a name given to it by 19th century scholars. But its actual Egyptian title is something more evocative, more indicative of what it was actually for. Reunu Pere Inru, the book of coming forth by day, coming forth from the tomb, from the darkness of death, into the light of a new kind of existence. The Book of the Dead is not a meditation on dying, it is a manual for living forever. The Book of the Dead is not a single fixed text. It is a collection of spells, more than 200 of them in its most complete versions, each one designed to help the deceased navigate a particular challenge of the afterlife journey. Spell 30 prevented the heart from speaking against the deceased in the Hall of Judgment. Spell 125 contained the negative confession, the declaration of innocence that the deceased was required to make before the 42 judges of the Hall of Mat. Spell 17 contained a complex theological exposition of the nature of the sun god's daily journey that was, in its complete form, one of the most sophisticated pieces of religious philosophy produced by the ancient world. Spell 6 transformed the Shapti figurines buried in the tomb into servants who would work on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife if agricultural labor was required of them. The journey of the soul after death, as the Egyptians understood it, began the moment the breath left the body. From that moment, the various non-physical aspects of the human being, the Egyptians had a more complex conception of the self than any simple soul-body binary, began their separate journeys. The K, the vital life force that was created simultaneously with the physical body and that was sustained throughout life by food and drink and the performance of the proper rituals, remained associated with the mummy in the tomb, requiring the continued offering of food and the performance of the rituals of the mortuary cult to maintain its existence. The Ba, often translated as the soul but more accurately understood as something like the individual personality or essence of a person, was free to leave the tomb and move between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and it is depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird, flying out of the tomb into the light of day and returning to the mummy at night. The Ak, the glorified spirit, was the form the deceased took after a successful passage through the afterlife journey. A being of light and power who had joined the company of the gods and the blessed dead in the field of reeds. The Hall of Two Truths, the Hall of Mart, was the place where the critical judgment of the dead took place, and its depiction in the Book of the Dead is one of the most extraordinary and most dramatically compelling scenes in all of ancient art. The hall is presided over by Osiris, the king of the dead, seated on his throne at the far end of the scene, wearing his characteristic Artef crown with its feathers and his wrappings, and holding his crook and flail. The deceased is led into the hall by Anubis, the jackal-headed god who was the guide of the dead and the protector of the embalming process, his black head calm and watchful, his hands steady on the arm of the person he is leading. In the center of the hall stands the great scales of justice, the scales of Mat. On one pan of the scales is placed the heart of the deceased, the organ that the Egyptians understood as the seat of consciousness and memory and moral decision-making, the organ that contained the record of every thought and action of the person's life. On the other pan is placed the feather of Ma'at, the white feather of truth and justice that was the symbol of the principle on which the entire Egyptian cosmic order was based. Ma'at herself, the goddess who embodied this principle, stands or kneels by the scales, or sometimes her feather stands alone in its place on the balance. And beside the scales crouches the devourer, the Amit, a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Three of the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian world combined into a single being of pure threat. If the scales do not balance, if the heart is heavier than the feather, if it is burdened with the weight of wrong actions and wrong thoughts and wrong intentions, the Amit will eat it and the deceased will suffer the second death, the final and permanent extinction of the personality, which the Egyptians called the death of the soul, and which was their deepest and most fundamental fear. But if the heart and the feather balance, if the heart is as light and as pure as Ma'at's feather, then the scribal god Thoth, depicted as an ibis-headed figure with a palette and a reed pen, records the favorable result, and the deceased is led before Osiris for his or her formal presentation among the blessed dead. And what follows is the entrance into Aru, the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Aru is described in Egyptian texts and depicted in tomb paintings as a place that is both familiar and transfigured. It is recognizably Egypt, with its fields of grain and its papyrus-lined canals, and its richer dark soil and its clear sky and its great flowing river. But it is Egypt perfected, Egypt as it might be if everything went perfectly all the time. If the floods always came at the right level and the crops always grew abundantly, and no storms came and no illness struck and no loss occurred. The grain in Ahu grows taller than any grain on earth. The fish in its rivers are fat and plentiful. The birds fly in great clouds over the papyrus marshes. There is music and feasting and reunion with the beloved dead. the parents and siblings and friends who went before, waiting in the sunlit fields. The concept of Aru is profoundly moving precisely because of its simplicity. It is not a transcendently different realm, not a place of abstract spiritual bliss or cosmic dissolution. It is this world, the world the Egyptians knew and loved and worked in and built their lives around, simply made whole, simply made permanent, simply made free from the shadows that fall across every human life. It is the inundation that always comes at exactly the right level. It is the harvest that is always abundant. It is the cool evening air by the river after a day's work. It is the smell of bread baking and the sound of children playing and the sight of the person you love most in the world coming toward you across a green field in the late afternoon light. It is, in other words, everything the Egyptian farmer standing at the edge of his flooded field in the early morning was hoping for and working toward and trying to sustain, rendered permanent and inviolable and free. The mythology that underpins all of this, the narrative framework within which the Egyptian understanding of death and rebirth operates, is the myth of Osiris and Isis, the foundational story of Egyptian religion. The myth that explained why death was not the end, and why the annual flooding of the Nile was an act of cosmic regeneration, and why the pharaoh was both human and divine, and why the sun rose every morning and would continue to rise forever. The myth exists in many versions, and the Egyptians did not feel the need to reconcile these versions into a single canonical account. Different cities and different temple traditions maintain their own versions, emphasizing different aspects of the story according to their own theological concerns, and the overall narrative that emerges from these various sources is complex and sometimes contradictory in its details, while being remarkably consistent in its fundamental shape and meaning. In the beginning, before the creation of the ordered world, there was none, the primordial ocean, the dark, undifferentiated water that contained within itself all the potential of existence. From this water emerged Atum, or in some versions Ra or Amun or Ta, or other divine beings depending on the theological tradition, and from Atum proceeded the first generation of gods. Eventually, through a process of divine generation that is recounted differently in different sources, the world as we know it came to be, and in it lived the first divine family. Osiris, the eldest son, and his wife Isis, and their brother Set and his wife Nephthys. And with the coming of this family, the drama of creation became the drama of conflict, of death and rebirth, of the struggle between order and chaos. That is, in the Egyptian worldview, the fundamental drama of the universe. Osiris was the first king, the divine ruler who taught humanity the arts of civilization, who showed them how to grow grain and tend cattle and live in community with one another, according to the principles of Ma'at. He was a good king, a just king, a king who loved the world he ruled and who ruled it well. And Set, his brother, the lord of the desert and of storms and of foreign lands, was consumed with envy and with rage and with the desire to possess what Osiris had. Set murdered his brother. The exact mechanism of the murder varies between versions of the story. In the most famous telling, Set built a beautiful coffin and invited Osiris to lie in it at a banquet, and when Osiris lay in the coffin, Set sealed it and threw it into the Nile. In another version, Set dismembered Osiris's body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Isis, the great magician, the most powerful of all the goddesses, searched the world for her husband. She searched the world for her husband. She searched the marshes and the desert and the foreign lands and the far shores of the ocean. She found him, or found the pieces of him, and with Nephthys and Anubis and Thoth, she reassembled the body and wrapped it in linen and performed the rituals that were the prototype for all mummification ever after. And she used her extraordinary magical power to do something that had never been done before. She breathed life back into the dead god, temporarily, enough for the divine seed to be planted within her, enough for Horus to be conceived. And then Osiris descended to the underworld, to the Duat, where he would rule as king of the dead and as the principle of resurrection and rebirth for all eternity. Isis bore Horus and hid him in the papyrus marshes of the delta, protecting him from Set's murderous intentions, nursing him and guarding him through the dangers of his childhood. When Horus was grown, he challenged Set for the kingship that had been his father's and was rightfully his. The battle between Horus and Set lasted, in some versions of the myth, 80 years, during which both gods suffered terrible injuries and inflicted terrible injuries on each other, the conflict being the archetypal expression of the struggle between order and chaos, between rightful authority and usurping violence. Eventually Horus prevailed. He was given the kingship of the living world. And the link between this myth and the institution of the pharaoh was direct and explicit. Every living pharaoh was the living Horus. Every dead pharaoh became Osiris, king of the dead. The mythology was not separate from the institution of kingship. It was its foundation, its explanation, its legitimation. The cycle of the sun, the daily drama of Ra's birth at dawn and his passage through the sky and his death at sunset and his nightly journey through the underworld and his rebirth at the next dawn, was understood in relation to the Osiris myth. The night sky, with its stars wheeling around the fixed point of the celestial pole, was the Du-Wat, the underworld through which Ra traveled each night in his solar bark, accompanied by the gods who defended him and the spells that protected him, and eventually, just before dawn, by the form of Osiris himself, whose power of resurrection enabled Ra's rebirth. The conjunction of the two great cycles, the sun's daily journey and Osiris's eternal reign among the dead, was the engine of the cosmos, the mechanism by which everything that died was reborn, by which the sun came up each morning, and the Nile rose each summer, and the crops grew each winter, and the pharaoh was renewed by his coronation rituals, and the dead were transformed into the blessed ark by their funerary rites. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, is one of the most recognizable figures in Egyptian religious art, and one of the most ancient. Jackals were associated with the dead in Egypt for the simplest and most practical of reasons. Jackals were observed near cemeteries, attracted by the smell of fresh burials, their black silhouettes moving along the edges of the necropolis in the twilight, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. From being associated with death and burial, Anubis became the god who presided over these processes, who guided the dead through the transition from life to the afterlife, who protected the mummy and the tomb, who stood guard over the hall of judgment. His image in Egyptian art is invariably calm, contained, watchful. He is not a frightening figure, not a menacing presence. He is a guardian, a protector, the divine version of the dog that stays by your side when everything else is uncertain. The image of Anubis performing the embalming process on the mummy of Osiris, reproduced on countless coffin lids and tomb walls, shows him bent over the body in the posture of the skilled craftsman, his black hands gentle on the white linen wrappings, his pointed ears erect, his lean face composed in an expression of total concentration. The message of this image is profoundly reassuring. The dead body is not abandoned. It is not alone. It is in the care of the divine physician, the divine craftsman, who will prepare it with all the skill and care and knowledge available for the journey ahead. The body will be preserved. The name will be maintained. The transformation will happen. The dead will live again. Horus the falcon, the son of Osiris and Isis, was the model for every living pharaoh, and his image as a falcon was one of the most ubiquitous in Egyptian art. The falcon was an appropriate divine symbol for reasons that anyone who has watched a falcon hunting will immediately understand. The falcon in flight has a quality of absolute mastery, of complete command of the medium through which it moves, that is unlike any other bird. It is capable of such stillness in hovering that it seems not to move at all, suspended in the air as if by an act of will, and then capable of the stoop, the dive toward its prey, that is the fastest movement of any living animal, a controlled fall of extraordinary precision and power. The falcon was the sky-masted. It was the divine energy of the sun moving through the air. It was the pharaoh's power, focused and directed and ultimately irresistible. The eyes of Horus, the Wedjat eyes, were among the most powerful protective symbols in Egyptian magic. The left eye was associated with the moon and with healing. The right eye was associated with the sun and with power. Together they expressed the completeness of divine protection. Wedjat eyes were painted on coffins so that the mummy could see out. They were carved on the prows of ships. They were worn as amulets by the living and placed among the wrappings of the mummified dead. They appeared on the walls of temples and on the wings of the pectoral jewelry worn by the pharaoh. They were everywhere, these eyes, watching and protecting, the eyes of the sky itself looking down on the world below. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom and the moon, was the divine scribe who recorded the verdict at the weighing of the heart, who arbitrated in the disputes between the gods, who carried the messages of Ra across the sky. The ibis, like the jackal, was a bird associated with the divine through observation. The sacred ibis, with its white body and black head and extraordinary curved beak, was a bird of the Nile's edges, a warder and a fisher, seen in the same kinds of places where writing was observed, the temples and the scribal schools and the courts where documents were read and judgments were recorded. The connection was perhaps not entirely logical, but it had the kind of associative rightness that typifies the Egyptian religious imagination, the ability to see in the natural world the forms and behaviors that corresponded to the divine qualities they expressed. The goddess Hathor, the celestial cow, the goddess of love and music and beauty and drunkenness and feminine power, was one of the most beloved and most widely worshipped deities in Egypt. She was the divine mother who suckled the pharaoh and gave him her divine milk and her divine power. She was the goddess who greeted the dead on the western bank of the Nile, appearing from behind the desert cliffs as a cow to offer her milk and her comfort to those who were making the transition from life to death. She was the goddess whose inebriation during her annual festival was a sacred act, the laughter and the dancing and the music and the beer of the Feast of Hathor being as much a part of the religious calendar as the solemn rituals of the mortuary cult. The god Ptah, the master craftsman of the gods, the patron of all skilled workers, was worshipped in his great temple at Memphis, the ancient capital in the north. He was depicted as a mummified figure standing upright, wrapped in a tight white shroud from which only his hands emerged to hold his composite scepter, his green skin indicating his association with vegetation and regeneration, his straight beard indicating his divine status, his eyes wide and unblinking. Ptah created the world through the power of his thought and his speech, a conception that has interesting parallels with the opening of the Gospel of John, but which was formulated thousands of years before the Christian era. Thought was the heart of Ptah, speech was his tongue, and the world was the result of these two divine faculties working together, the cosmos as an act of divine language. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, the Eye of Ra, the destroyer who protected the divine order by destroying its enemies, was the goddess of plague and war and the fierce, searing heat of the summer sun. She was terrifying, genuinely terrifying. Her image with its lioness head and its solar disk and its Uraeus cobra and its expression of absolute ferocity, one of the most powerful and most unsettling in Egyptian art. She was also a healer, because in the Egyptian religious understanding, the power to destroy carried with it the power to heal, and Sekhmet's priests were physicians as much as they were magicians and ritual specialists. The goddess of plague was also the goddess who could end the plague. The goddess of the burning sun was also the goddess who could send the cool north wind. These gods and many more, the crocodile god Sobek, the frog goddess Heket, the scorpion goddess Sekhet, the hippopotamus goddess Tauret, who protected women in childbirth, the cat goddess Bastet, whose gentle aspect was the domestic cat and whose fierce aspect was the lioness, the cobra goddess Wadjet, who protected Lower Egypt, the vulture goddess Nekbet, who protected Upper Egypt. These gods and more populated the Egyptian religious world, each of them with their temples and their festivals and their mythological narratives and their day lives of the people who worship them, with their temple lives of the people who worship them. The Egyptian religious world was not a system that a single mind designed or that a single institution enforced. It grew over 3,000 years from the accumulation of local traditions and theological experiments and mythological narratives and practical magic, and the result was a world in which the divine was everywhere, in the river and the sun and the stars and the crops and the animals and the bodies of the living and the bodies of the dead, in which every aspect of existence had its divine counterpart and its mythological explanation and its ritual requirement. This was not a simple world. It was an extraordinarily complex one, requiring a specialist class of priests and scribes to maintain the rituals and interpret the texts and keep the machinery of the divine order running smoothly. The temples were the centers of this divine machinery, and the Temple of Karnak at Luxor is the greatest of all Egyptian temple complexes, the largest ancient religious site in the world, a complex that was built and added to and elaborated and expanded over more than 2,000 years by dozens of different pharaohs, each one adding their own courts and pylons and obelisks and shrines to the accumulating mass of the whole. It is not, from the outside, immediately comprehensible as a unified structure. It is too large, too complex, too dense with different building periods and different architectural styles and different overlapping intentions. But within it, there are moments of extraordinary power and beauty that reward the patient and attentive visitor. The Great Hypostyle Hall is one of the most extraordinary interior spaces ever created by human beings. It was built primarily during the reigns of Seti I and Ramses II in the 13th century BCE, and it covers an area of approximately 5,300 square meters, making it the largest columned hall in the world. Within this space stand 134 massive stone columns arranged in 16 rows, the two central rows rising to a height of 24 meters and the outer rows to a height of 13. The columns are not smooth cylinders. They are covered, every surface of every column, with carved and painted relief, hieroglyphic texts and images of the gods and the pharaoh performing the rituals that were the reason for the hall's existence. To stand in the Hypostyle Hall is to stand inside a forest of stone, a manufactured landscape of vertical mass and deep shadow that is unlike any other experience architecture can offer. The columns are enormous, more enormous than you expect even if you know the dimensions in advance, and they crowd together in a way that creates a complex and shifting pattern of illuminated surfaces and deep shadows as you move through the space. The light in the central aisle falls from a series of clerestory windows, narrow openings near the top of the higher columns, and it enters the hall in long, angled beams that catch the dust in the air and turn it to a kind of luminous haze, a soft golden light that seems not to come from any single direction, but that emanate from the stone itself. Imagine the Hypostyle Hall at night, under the stars that are visible through those same clerestory windows as sharp points of light in a rectangle of deep blue sky. The columns would have been painted in the original, their carved surfaces covered in pigments of red and blue and green and gold and yellow and black, the colors vivid under the lamplight of the ritual processions that moved through this hall on the great festival occasions. The smell of burning incense, the heavy, resinous smoke of frankincense and myrrh and kyphi, the Egyptian sacred incense that was a complex mixture of resins and herbs and oils, would have filled the hall and seeped into the stone over centuries of use, leaving a trace that perhaps still exists in the molecular structure of the limestone, if not in the air. The sound of the priests chanting, their voices rising and falling in the ancient patterns of the liturgy, would have echoed strangely in this space, multiplied and modified by the stone surfaces until the individual voices were transformed into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the stone itself. Beyond the Hypostyle Hall, deeper into the complex, the sacred lake sits still and dark under the night sky. The sacred lake was used for ritual purification, the priests bathing in its waters before performing their duties in the temple. And it was also a kind of cosmic symbol, a representation of the primordial ocean of none from which the world had emerged at the creation. Its surface at night reflects the stars overhead with a stillness that is almost uncanny, almost too perfect, as though the lake is trying to become the sky, or the sky is trying to become the lake. The obelisks of Karnak, those tall tapering fingers of red Aswan granite pointing at the sky, are among the most striking elements of the complex. Most of them are gone now, removed by Roman emperors or by later rulers to grace the centers of other cities, and only two remain standing within the complex. The obelisk of Hatshepsut, one of the tallest obelisks in Egypt, its tip still capped with its electrum, the alloy of gold and silver that would have flashed in the sunlight like a signal, like a declaration, like a burning point of divine attention directed at the sky. The sacred precinct of Karnak contains not just the main temple of Amun, but subsidiary temples dedicated to Mut, the consort of Amun, and to Khonsu, the moon god, who was their son. And beyond these, the open-air museum where fragments of smashed and rebuilt monuments are laid out in the sun, the reconstructed red chapel of Hatshepsut, with its beautiful alternating blocks of red quartzite and black granite, and at the far end of the south axis, the long avenue of ram-headed sphinxes that once connected Karnak to the Temple of Luxor 2 miles to the south, a processional road that was used on the great festivals of Oif, a road along which the gods moved between their houses in the great ceremonies that were the heartbeat of the Velithal, the road along which the gods the Khans, were the Egyptian Seridia. The Temple of Luxor, at the southern end of this avenue, is a different kind of beautiful from Karnak. Where Karnak is overwhelming, is vast and complex and slightly chaotic in the way that a thing built over 2,000 years by dozens of different hands inevitably becomes. Luxor is harmonious. It was built primarily in 2 great campaigns, by Amenhotep III and by Ramses II. And despite the different periods of its construction, it has a coherence and an elegance that Karnak lacks. The great court of Ramses II, with its massive seated statues of the king and its 2 obelisks, of which one still stands in situ and the other stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, having been given to France in 1829 in exchange for the clock that ticks, slowly and inappropriately, in the great pylon of Karnak. The colonnade of Amenhotep III, 14 pairs of columns with their papyrus bud capitals, creating a corridor of extraordinary beauty that leads from the open court into the deeper, darker spaces of the inner temple. And within the inner temple, in the heart of the sanctuary, something extraordinary. During the Christian period, the inner chambers of the Luxor temple were converted into a church, and the painted decorations of the pagan temple were plastered over. When the plaster was removed in the 20th century, the Egyptian paintings beneath were revealed again after 15 centuries of concealment. Their colors still vivid, still alive, the images of the gods and the pharaoh in their eternal ritual postures emerging from beneath the Christian paint with the patient permanence of something that had always known it would outlast whatever covered it. The Egyptian theological world, the world of Osiris and Horus and Anubis and Ma'at and the weighing of the heart and the field of reeds and the great hall of 2 truths, is not a world that ended when Egypt itself ended. It was absorbed into the religious cultures that followed it, transformed and partially disguised but still present in the ideas and images and intuitions that passed from Egyptian religion into the Hellenistic mystery cults, into early Christianity, into the Gnostic traditions, into the esoteric currents that run through the history of Western spirituality. The idea that the soul survives death and is judged for its actions. The idea that the divine can take human form. The idea of the dying and rising God who defeats death and opens the way to eternal life. The idea that the universe is governed by a principle of divine order that is simultaneously cosmic law and moral law. These ideas are not exclusively Egyptian, but their history in the West passes through Egypt, through the fertile soil of the Nile Valley, through the dark interior of the Egyptian tomb. By the time the great pharaonic traditions had been running for more than 2,000 years, the world around Egypt had changed almost beyond recognition. The great empires of the ancient Near East, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, had risen and fallen and risen again. The Macedonians under Alexander the Great had swept through the entire ancient world in a decade of extraordinary conquest, and Egypt had changed hands for what felt, to some, like another in a long series of foreign occupations, but what was, in fact, something entirely different. Alexander came to Egypt, not as a conqueror in the conventional sense, not as someone who wanted to replace what was there with something new, but as someone who wanted, with a genuine hunger that was part of his unique and extraordinary character, to become part of what was already there. Alexander visited the Oracle of Aman at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, making the long, difficult journey across the desert to reach the Oracle sanctuary and receiving from it a confirmation whose exact content was never made fully public: that he was the son of Amun-Ra, that he was Pharaoh in the full theological sense, that he was Horus on the throne of the living and would one day be Osiris in the kingdom of the dead. He visited Memphis and offered to the Egyptian gods. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of the Delta, choosing the site himself with a characteristic combination of strategic genius and aesthetic sensitivity, the site being a natural harbor of unusual excellence, with a limestone ridge protecting it from the prevailing winds and a narrow isthmus connecting it to a small offshore island that would become, in the following decades, the location of the Pharaohs, the great lighthouse that was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Alexandria grew with the extraordinary speed that characterized Alexander's projects, and when Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, it became the capital of the portion of his empire that fell to his general Ptolemy, the founder of the dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the greatest city in the ancient world outside of Rome, perhaps even greater than Rome at the height of its power. A city of astounding cultural richness and extraordinary intellectual vitality, a place where the Greek tradition of rational inquiry and the Egyptian tradition of religious and practical knowledge met and mingled and produced something that was more than either alone. The Library of Alexandria was the most famous institution of this cultural efflorescence, the institution that more than any other has come to represent the Ptolemaic vision of Alexandria as the capital of a civilization of ideas. It was founded probably under Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the early 3rd century BCE as part of the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses, a research institution that brought scholars from across the ancient world to Alexandria to work in its collection and to pursue their research under royal patronage. At its height, the library contained, by ancient accounts, between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, not books in the modern sense, but papyrus rolls, each containing a text that might be a complete short work or a portion of a longer one. The scale of this collection is difficult to comprehend even in modern terms. Imagine a room, or rather a series of rooms, lined from floor to ceiling with scrolls, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, each one containing the accumulated thought of someone who had lived and struggled with ideas and found a way to put those ideas into words and preserve them in writing. The works of Homer, all of Greek tragedy and comedy, the philosophical texts of Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, the mathematical works of Euclid and Archimedes, the astronomical observations of Hipparchus and Eratosthenes, the historical works of Thucydides and Herodotus, the medical texts of Hippocrates and his successors, the poetic works of Sophocles and his successors, the poetic works of Sophocles and his thirst, the astronautical record Egypt texts translated into Greek Babylonian astronomical records, Hebrew sacred texts translated for the first time into Anandritids, the Asphodoteics, the Apcubic. The scholars who worked in the library were not merely custodians of this knowledge but active contributors to it. Eratosthenes, who was chief librarian in the 3rd century BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth with extraordinary accuracy, using the angle of the sun's shadow at noon on the summer solstice in 2 different Egyptian cities, Aswan and Alexandria, and the measurement of the distance between them. His result was within a few percent of the actual circumference, a triumph of applied geometric reasoning that would not be significantly improved upon for more than 1,000 years. Aristophanes of Byzantium, another chief librarian, established the standard texts of the Greek dramatists that we still use today, comparing multiple manuscript versions and marking the superior readings in the margin. Callimachus, the great poet and critic, compiled the Pentateuch, a catalogue of all the works in the library, organized by author and subject, a bibliographic achievement of enormous importance for the transmission of ancient learning. The scholars of Alexandria worked by the light of oil lamps in the evening, and in the clear Mediterranean light that came through the high windows of the Mausion in the day, sitting at low tables or reclining on cushioned benches with their scrolls unrolled before them, their reed pens moving across the papyrus, their minds ranging across the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Across the room, a mathematician is working through a geometrical proof, his stylus marking figures in the wax of a small tablet. By the window, an astronomer is comparing observations of star positions recorded in Babylonian texts against his own recent measurements. At a long table in the center, several scholars are engaged in a heated discussion about the correct reading of a corrupt passage in a manuscript of Aeschylus, their voices rising and falling in the traditional cadences of academic disagreement. The great question of what happened to the Library of Alexandria is one of history's most famous and most debated mysteries. The popular image is of a single catastrophic destruction, a fire that consumed everything in a single terrible night, wiping out centuries of accumulated wisdom in a matter of hours. This image is vivid and emotionally compelling, but almost certainly inaccurate. The library's decline was probably a gradual process, the result of multiple episodes of damage and neglect, beginning perhaps with Julius Caesar's accidental fire in the harbor in 48 BCE that may have destroyed some portion of the collection, continuing through the civil conflicts of the Roman period and the religious conflicts of the Roman period and the religious conflicts of the late antique period, and the administrative changes that reduced royal support for the institution. There was no single night when the library burned. There was a long, slow diminishment, a gradual dimming of the light, a process by which the extraordinary accumulation of knowledge was dispersed and scattered and eventually lost, most of it irrecoverably. What we have lost is incalculable. We know from ancient references and catalogues that there were thousands of works in the ancient world that are now entirely gone, known only by their titles or by a handful of quotations preserved in the works of other writers. The complete plays of Sophocles and Euripides, of which we have only a small fraction of the originals. The historical works of dozens of ancient historians whose existence we know only because other writers mention them. The medical writings of dozens of ancient physicians, the mathematical and astronomical works that might have advanced the development of science by centuries if they had survived into the medieval and early modern periods. The loss is not just a loss of knowledge, but a loss of access to the minds that produced that knowledge. A loss of contact with the full range of human intellectual achievement in the ancient world. But something survived. Not everything, not enough. But something. The works of Euclid and Archimedes and Ptolemy the astronomer came back to the West through Arabic translations and through Byzantine manuscripts copied by monks who may not have understood what they were preserving, but who copied faithfully nonetheless. The great dramas of Sophocles and Euripides, the fragments of Sappho, the dialogues of Plato, the treatises of Aristotle, the histories of Thucydides and Herodotus and Plutarch and Livy. These survived by various routes through various combinations of accident and intention to reach us. And in reaching us, they carry with them something of the air of the library, something of the clarity and the intellectual ambition and the belief that the world can be understood through the disciplined exercise of human reason, that seems to have been the gift of Alexandria to the cultures that came after it. The last ruler of an independent Egypt before the Roman conquest was not a pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian sense, but she was, in every sense that mattered, the last of the great Egyptian rulers, the last person who could claim continuity with the 3,000-year tradition of the Nile civilization. Cleopatra VII Philopator, known to history simply as Cleopatra, was born in 69 BCE and came to power at the age of 18 as co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. She was the first member of her dynasty, after nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt, to learn the Egyptian language, to speak to her subjects in their own tongue, to present herself to the Egyptian priesthood as a genuine Egyptian ruler rather than a Greek one. She also spoke 8 or 9 other languages according to the ancient sources, including several of the languages of the Egyptian kingdom's neighbors and trading partners. Cleopatra was, by every ancient account, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary political skill. Her relationship with Julius Caesar, which produced a son, Caesarion, and secured her political position against her brother's challenge, was not merely a romantic entanglement, but a sophisticated piece of diplomatic strategy that demonstrated her understanding of the political reality of her time, which was that Egypt's independence could only be maintained through alignment with the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, which was Rome. After Caesar's assassination, her relationship with Mark Antony, which produced 3 children and lasted more than a decade, and was conducted in a setting of deliberately theatrical magnificence that was itself a political statement about Egyptian power and cultural prestige, was the same strategy carried forward into a different political configuration. The final confrontation between the Roman political traditions of order and restraint and the Ptolemaic tradition of divine monarchy and theatrical magnificence played out in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was defeated by Octavian's forces in a naval engagement that decided the fate of the ancient world. Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra, captured by Octavian, refused to be displayed in his triumph, the ultimate humiliation for a Roman audience, and chose instead to die, probably by the bite of an asp, the cobra that was sacred to the Egyptian gods and whose bite, in Egyptian belief, conferred a form of divine death. A death appropriate for a queen who was also a goddess, the living embodiment of Isis, the Great Mother, the Queen of Magic, the one who had gathered the scattered pieces of Osiris and breathed life back into what had been destroyed. With Cleopatra's death in August of 30 BCE, the 3,000-year tradition of pharaonic Egypt came to its end. Rome absorbed Egypt as a province, a uniquely important province that was treated differently from all others, governed directly by the emperor's personal representative rather than by a senatorial governor. Because Egypt's grain fields were the food supply of Rome itself, and because Egypt's wealth was so extraordinary that any senator who gained control of it would have the resources to challenge the emperor, the Roman emperors adopted the titles and iconography of pharaoh in their official representations within Egypt. They were shown on temple walls in the traditional style, making offerings to the Egyptian gods in the traditional manner, wearing the double crown and the crook and the flail, because the Egyptian priestly establishment required this performance of pharaonic identity from whoever ruled Egypt, and because the Romans were pragmatic enough to provide it. But it was a performance without the living tradition behind it, a continuation of the forms after the substance had departed. Egypt under Rome was still Egypt in many of the ways that mattered. The Nile still flooded. The farmers still planted and harvested in the rhythms that had been established since the Neolithic. The priests still performed the rituals in the great temples, and new temples were still being built in the traditional style. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera and the Temple of Horus at Edfu, both of which survive in extraordinary completeness, were completed during the Roman period. The Egyptian gods were still worshipped, and indeed, the worship of the Egyptian gods spread throughout the Roman world during this period, with the cult of Isis in particular achieving a remarkable popularity across the entire Mediterranean basin, from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Isis, the Great Mother who had conquered death and restored her husband to life and raised her son to avenge his father, spoke to something deep in human religious experience that transcended the particular cultural context of Egypt and reached people of the most diverse backgrounds and traditions. The transition from the world of the pharaohs to the world of Rome was not instantaneous but gradual, not a clean break but a slow transformation, the way a river changes its course over centuries, shifting by degrees, so gradual that no one watching on any given day would notice the movement, but so cumulative that anyone comparing the river's path across a century would see that it had become something different from what it had been. The stone temples still stood, the hieroglyphs were still carved, the priests still performed the ancient rites, but the living chain of transmission, the tradition passed from teacher to student, from father to son, from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New, the continuous living thread that had run through all the changes and transitions of 3,000 years, was fraying, thinning, becoming less substantial, becoming something that would eventually, over the centuries of Roman rule, and then Byzantine Christian rule, and then Islamic rule, disappear entirely, leaving the temples standing in silence with their carved walls full of messages that no one alive could read. The moment of rediscovery, when it came from an unexpected direction and in an unexpected form. When Napoleon Bonaparte led his expedition to Egypt in 1798, he brought with him not only soldiers, but scholars, a remarkable group of scientists and artists and antiquarians who were charged with the systematic documentation of everything they could find. The monuments and the landscapes and the natural history and the human culture of this extraordinary country that Europeans had been fascinated by since antiquity, but had never systematically studied. The result of their work, the Description de l'Égypte, published between 1809 and 1829 in 23 massive volumes of text and illustrations, was the founding document of modern Egyptology, the first serious attempt to bring the tools of modern scientific observation to bear on the ancient Egyptian evidence. Among the discoveries made during the Napoleonic expedition was the Rosetta Stone, found by a French officer named Bouchard near the town of Rashid in the Delta in 1799. A granodiorite stele inscribed with the same text in 3 scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. The stone passed to British hands when the French capitulated in 1801, and it has been in the British Museum ever since. The significance of the stone was immediately recognized because the Greek text could be read, and if the 3 texts were indeed the same text in 3 scripts, as seemed likely, then the Greek text could serve as a key to deciphering the hieroglyphics, unlocking the 3,000-year silence of the Egyptian written tradition. The decipherment was a long and difficult process, involving several scholars working independently across more than 2 decades, culminating in the work of the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, who in 1822 published his letter to Monsieur, who in 1822 published his letter to Monsieur Dacier, containing the essential breakthrough, the recognition that the hieroglyphic script was neither purely ideographic nor purely phonetic, but a complex combination of the two, a recognition that opened the 20th edition, writing that gave back to the world a religious and intellectual tradition, writing and rendering and this. But the 19th century was the great age of Egyptian archaeology. Though archaeology is perhaps too generous a word for much of what was done in that period. The great sites were extensively excavated, which often meant extensively looted by a succession of European adventurers and scholars and collectors, operating in a legal and ethical environment very different from our own. The great Egyptian collections of the European museums, the Louvre, and the British Museum and the Berlin Museum and the Turin Museum and many others were assembled during this period from objects removed from Egypt under arrangements that would not be considered acceptable today. But amid the depredations there was also genuine scholarship, genuine attempts to understand and document what was being found, and the foundations of modern Egyptology were laid during this period by scholars of real intelligence and dedication, who recognized that they were working with evidence of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, the discovery that most captured the popular imagination, and that in many ways defined for the 20th century what ancient Egypt meant and what it felt like to encounter the ancient Egyptian world, came in 1922, on the 4th of November, in the Valley of the Kings. Howard Carter, a British archaeologist who had been working in the valley for more than a decade under the patronage of the Earl of Carnarvon, was at the point of despair. He had been searching systematically for the tomb of a minor pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a king who had died young after a short reign and who had been largely erased from the official record by his successors, a king whose existence was known primarily from a few small objects that had appeared on the antiquities market over the preceding decades. The tomb had not been found. Carnarvon's patience and finances were both stretched nearly to their limits. One more season, Carter had been told, one more attempt, and then the search would be abandoned. On the 4th of November, one of Carter's workmen, clearing away the debris from an earlier excavation in the valley floor, struck a stone step with his implement, then another step, then another. They were uncovering a flight of steps cut into the bedrock, descending toward a sealed doorway. Carter ordered the staircase cleared, revealing a plaster door bearing the seals of the royal necropolis and, later, the cartouche of the king whose tomb he had been seeking. He had found Tutankhamun. He sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. It is one of the great telegrams in the history of archaeology. Carnarvon rushed to Egypt, and on the 26th of November, in the presence of Carter and Carnarvon and a small group of others, the sealed door was opened, and Carter made a small hole in the plaster with an iron rod and held up a candle to peer into the darkness beyond. What he saw has been described many times because Carter himself described it with a vividness and a precision that has made his account one of the most compelling passages in the literature of discovery. He saw, he wrote, art of a moment in which his eyes adjusted the darkness and the hot air that came rushing out of the open tomb after than 3,000 years of sealed silence, strange animals, statues and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. Carnarvon, standing behind him in an agony of impatience, asked the question that has become famous, "Can you see anything?" And Carter gave his equally famous answer, yes, wonderful things, the things that Carter saw in those first moments of candlelight, the things that emerged over the following weeks and months at Eret, or the tomb of Tutankhamun, the tomb of a minor king who had died young and who had been given, by the standards of the New Kingdom royal burial tradition, a relatively small and hastily prepared tomb, was filled with objects of staggering beauty and variety. There were gilded wooden shrines nested one inside the other like a series of golden boxes, each one covered in religious texts and images of the gods. There was the great golden sarcophagus, itself nested inside two outer coffins, the innermost one made of solid gold and weighing more than 100 kilograms. There were the canopic shrine and its accompanying golden goddesses, their arms outstretched in an eternal gesture of protective embrace. There was the painted wooden chest, whose imagery, showing the young king in his chariot triumphing over his enemies, is one of the masterpieces of Egyptian decorative art. There was the throne, covered in gold and silver and semi-precious stones, with its extraordinary back panel showing the young king and his queen and Amun in an intimate domestic scene of such beauty and tenderness that it seems to bridge the 3,000-year gap between their world and ours, as though that gap were nothing at all. There were alabaster vessels and linen garments and wooden beds and chairs and chests and boxes and musical instruments and games and foods and wines and oils and perfumes and weapons and walking sticks and model boats and model granaries and model works and walking granaries and model worksome shabtis and amulets and luts and rings and necklaces and pectorals and diadems and all the accumulated necessities and luxuries of a royal life, preserved in almost perfect condition through 3,000 years of sealed darkness, as though waiting for the moment when they would be brought back into the light and shown to a world. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a media sensation of a kind that archaeology had never previously generated. Lord Carnarvon had sold exclusive rights to the story to the Times of London, which meant that correspondents from other newspapers who had travelled to Egypt expecting to report on one of the great discoveries of the century were shut out of official information. The result was a fury of unofficial reporting, speculation, rumour and invention that created around the discovery an atmosphere of almost mythological excitement. When Carnarvon died in April of 1923, 5 months after the tomb was opened, from blood poisoning following a mosquito bite that became infected, the newspapers invented the curse of the Pharaohs, the idea that Tutankhamun had taken revenge on those who had violated his rest, and the story of the curse has followed the discovery ever since, a layer of legend deposited over the archaeological reality like sediment over an ancient site. The reality was remarkable enough without the legend. Carter spent 10 years from 1922 to 1932 systematically excavating and documenting the contents of the tomb, working with extraordinary care and patience in the cramped and sweltering conditions of the Valley of the Kings, photographing every object in place before it was moved, recording every detail of the fine context, treating the contents of the tomb with a respect and a seriousness that was not always shown to the ancient Egyptian evidence in that period. The result of his work, combined with the subsequent scientific analysis of the objects he recovered, is the most complete picture we have of the material culture of the New Kingdom court, a picture of extraordinary richness and detail that has transformed our understanding of the world, that produced the great monuments of Egyptian civilization. Tutankhamun himself, the boy king who died at about the age of 19 after a reign of about 10 years, has become the most famous of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, not because of his historical importance, which was not great, but because of the accident of his tomb's survival and discovery. We know more about him now than about almost any other ancient Egyptian, because his body and the objects buried with him have been subjected to the most intensive scientific analysis. We know that he was slight in build, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, that he suffered from several genetic disorders that were the result of the close inbreeding of the royal family, that he had a clubfoot and used walking sticks, that he probably had malaria, and that he died of a combination of injuries and illnesses whose exact nature is still debated. We know that his father was almost certainly Akhenaten, the heretic king who had tried to reform Egyptian religion and failed, and that his mother was one of Akhenaten's secondary wives or relatives. We know that he came to the throne as a small child, probably about 9 years old, and that he was guided in his early reign by the advisor Ai, who may have been his great-uncle or another senior court official, and by the general Horemheb, who was the real military power in the kingdom. We know that during his short reign, the policies of the Amarna period were reversed, that the old gods were restored to their primacy, that the temples were reopened, that the capital was moved back from Akhetaten to Memphis and then to Thebes, that the erasure of the Amarna experiment from the official record began. And we know from the objects in his tomb and from the love the images of his queen show on his throne and in the reliefs of the tomb chapel, that he was a young man who loved hunting and who played the lute and who drove chariots, and who was, in the end, a young man who died too young, cut off before he could become whatever he might have become, leaving behind him an accidental monument of extraordinary beauty that has kept his memory alive for 3,000 years and will keep it alive for as long as human civilization continues to find beauty that has kept his memory in the things that survive from the past. The objects from Tutankhamun's tomb now reside in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, or are traveling as part of the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, which when fully open will be the largest archaeological museum in the world, specifically designed to house and display the entire collection from the tomb together in a single space for the first time since it was assembled in 1323 BCE. The golden mask, the most iconic single object from the ancient world, will be there. The nested coffins and the golden sarcophagus will be there. The shrine and the throne and the alabaster canopic chest and all the thousands of objects that Carter and his team spent a decade extracting from the tomb with such care and patience will be there. And visitors from across the world will stand before them and feel, as visitors to the Egyptian monuments have always felt, that particular sensation of contact with something vast and ancient and still somehow alive. Something that has survived the passage of centuries, not merely as an artifact, but as an expression of the human desire to make things of beauty and meaning that will outlast the individual life and speak, across whatever distance of time, to the lives that come after. This sensation is not an illusion. It is one of the truest things that human beings experience when you stand before the golden mask of Tutankhamun and look into the eyes that have been looking back at visitors for almost a century now, and they were made by craftsmen who lived 3,000 years ago and who understood something about the power of beauty and the desire of the dead to be remembered. You are experiencing a real connection across time, a real communication between the human beings who made that object and the human being who is standing before it. The communication is not verbal and not intellectual, but something more fundamental, something that operates at the level of the shared human experience of mortality and the desire to transcend it, the desire to make something that will last, the desire to be remembered, the desire to be remembered, the desire to be beopened, the desire to leave behind evidence that one was here and meeting. The Egyptians understood this desire more clearly and expressed it more magnificently than any other civilization in human history. They built for eternity, and they very nearly achieved it. The pyramids are still there. The great temples are still there. The hieroglyphic texts are still there, legible now to those trained to read them, speaking in voices that were silenced for 14 centuries but that have been given back to us through the extraordinary intellectual achievement of decipherment, speaking of gods and kings and the movement of the stars and the flooding of the river and the weighing of the heart and the journey through the Duat and the fields of Aru and the eternal life that waits on the other side of death for those who have lived well and spoken truth and kept faith with the gods themselves. The story of ancient Egypt is not a story that is over. It is a story that is still being told, still being discovered, still being understood. New excavations are taking place every year, and every excavation adds something to our understanding of this extraordinary civilization. In 2023, archaeologists working at Luxor discovered a large administrative complex from the New Kingdom period that had been buried under later construction. In the eastern delta, excavations are revealing the remains of the great Ramesside capital of Pi-Ramesses, the city that Ramesses II built as his primary residence. In the Valley of the Kings, the possibility that unexcavated tombs remain hidden beneath the valley floor continues to generate excitement and investigation. In the deserts of Egypt, satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar are revealing the outlines of buried structures that have never been excavated, adding to a catalogue of unexcavated sites that is far larger than the catalogue of excavated ones. And in the museums of the world, the objects that have been removed from Egypt over the past 2 centuries are being re-examined with new analytical techniques that are revealing information that was not detectable with older methods. X-ray fluorescence analysis is determining the precise chemical composition of ancient pigments and metals and glass. DNA analysis is untangling the family relationships of the royal mummies and revealing where the people who made Egyptian civilization came from and how they were related to each other and to the populations of surrounding regions. Carbon-14 dating is refining the absolute chronology of Egyptian history in ways that sometimes confirm the traditional chronology and sometimes reveal that it needs revision. Infrared imaging is revealing painted and carved decorations that have become invisible to the naked eye through the processes of time and pollution and handling. Each new discovery, each new analysis, each new reading of a previously unstudied text adds something to the picture, fills in a corner of the enormous mosaic that is our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. The picture is already the most detailed we have of any ancient civilization, more detailed than our picture of ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient Mesopotamia. Because the Egyptian climate has preserved organic materials that would decay in other environments. Because the Egyptian tradition of inscribing texts on stone walls has left records that have survived where papyrus documents have not. Because the Egyptian practice of providing the dead with everything they would need for the afterlife has preserved objects that would otherwise have been used until they wore out and thawed through habit. But the picture is still incomplete, still full of gaps and uncertainties and questions that may never be answered. We do not know what Khufu looked like because the only image of him that survives is a tiny ivory statuette less than 3 inches tall, and we do not know enough about his personality or his private life to understand him as a human being rather than as a royal function. We do not know what happened to Nefertiti, whose mummy has not been conclusively identified and who disappears from the historical record at a certain point in the later Mana period in a way that is genuinely mysterious. We do not know the full extent of Egyptian trade networks, or the precise nature of Egyptian diplomatic relationships with the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa. We do not know the details of the religious practices that took place in the inner sanctuaries of the great temples, because these were secret and were never written down. We do not know the names of the architects who designed the Great Pyramids, or the artists who painted the great tomb chapels. because Egyptian culture attributed these achievements to the royal patrons who commissioned them, rather than to the individual craftsmen and thinkers who created them. These gaps are not failures of scholarship, they are the inevitable consequences of the passage of time and the imperfect survival of the evidence. They are reminders that even the most thoroughly studied ancient civilization remains in many ways mysterious, that the past is never fully recoverable, that the human beings who lived and thought and created in the ancient world remain in some fundamental sense beyond our reach, separated from us by the unbridgeable distance of time and cultural difference. But they are also invitations to continued inquiry, continued imagination, continued engagement with the evidence that does survive, continued attempts to understand and appreciate and learn from the extraordinary achievement of one of the greatest of all human civilizations. The Nile still flows. This is the most important fact about ancient Egypt from the perspective of the present, and it is the fact that most strongly connects the ancient world to the modern one. The river that supported the civilization of the Pharaohs is still there, still flowing north from its origins in the Ethiopian highlands and the lakes of equatorial Africa, still crossing the Sahara through its narrow valley, still spreading into the delta at the Mediterranean coast, still giving life to the narrow strip of cultivable land on its banks. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, has fundamentally changed the relationship between the river and the land by controlling the annual flood that was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture for 10,000 years. The inundation no longer comes. The fields are no longer covered every year with the black silt that built and sustained Egyptian civilization, but the river still flows, and the farms along its banks are still among the most productive in Africa. And the cities that line its course, Cairo and Luxor and Aswan and Alexandria, are still among the most vibrant in the region, and the monuments are still there, rising from the desert and the riverbank with the same extraordinary presence they have had for thousands of years. The Great Pyramid at Giza is not quite as tall as it was when Khufu was buried inside it, because it has lost the white limestone casing that once covered it and the gold capstone that once crowned it. But it is still the most massive structure in the world, still visible from a remarkable distance, still capable of producing in the viewer who stands at its base that sensation of scale that is unlike any other human experience. The temples of Luxor and Karnak are still standing, their massive stone columns still reaching toward the sky, their walls still covered in the hieroglyphic texts and the painted reliefs that were carved and painted by craftsmen who believed that the art they were making was sacred, that it was a form of prayer, that it was a way of maintaining the order of the universe against the chaos that perpetually threatened to overwhelm it. Abu Simbel is still there, relocated in one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the 20th century, the twin temples that Ramesses II carved in the living rock of the Nubian cliff face, now standing a little higher than they originally did, lifted from the path of the rising waters of Lake Nasser by a UNESCO project that cut the temples into hundreds of pieces and reassembled them on the plateau above with a precision that means the alignment still works. The sun Telidibethatus, in shadow the sanctuary twice a year, still illumining the stamboat of Bath, the stemmet, is there today. Ramesses is still pointing at the sunrise. The alignment holds. The ancient astronomers got it right. The Valley of the Kings is still there, the dry secret canyon in the limestone hills above Luxor, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried, in an attempt to defeat the tomb robbers who had emptied the royal pyramid tombs of the earlier periods. The attempt largely failed. Of the 63 tombs that have been found in the valley, only one, Tutankhamun's, survived essentially intact into the modern period. But the tombs themselves, their chambers and corridors painted with extraordinary images and text, are still there, and they are among the most extraordinary things that any human civilization has ever created. Spaces designed not for the living, but for the dead. Spaces that were meant to be sealed and forgotten the moment the funeral procession departed, and that therefore were decorated without any consideration of how they would appear to living viewers, with a directness and a power and a beauty that is unlike anything else in human artistic production. standing in the inner chamber of the tomb of Seti I, looking up at the astronomical ceiling with its painted constellations and the precise positions of the stars, or looking at the walls with their representations of the Book of Gates and the Amduat, the complex narrative maps of the underworld journey that the dead king must navigate on his way from death to rebirth, you are in the presence of something that was made with extraordinary skill and intention, and that has survived the 3,000-year interval between its inner preservation that is almost miraculous. The colors are still vivid, the lines are still precise. The figures of the gods still move with the gravity and the grace that the ancient craftsmen gave them, still performing their eternal functions in the eternal darkness of the tomb, still maintaining the order of the universe against the chaos of oblivion. This is what the Egyptians sought. This is what they built for and worked for and organized their entire civilization around the possibility of achieving. Not immortality in the biological sense, not the literal continuation of the individual consciousness beyond death, but something more achievable and in some ways more profound. The continuation of the self in the memory of the living. The continuation of the work in the stone and the paint and the papyrus that preserved it. The continuation of the name in the hieroglyphic inscription that was carved on the wall and that could be read as long as the wall stood and as long as anyone knew how to read it. The Egyptians knew that the name was a part of the soul, that to speak a name was to give life to the one who bore it, that to erase a name was a form of murder, more final than physical death, and that to preserve a name across the centuries was a form of resurrection. And so the names are preserved. Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, Thutmose and Hatshepsut and Amenhotep, Ramses and Seti and Tutankhamun, Nefertiti and Nefertari and Ti. Imhotep the architect, who built the first pyramid and who was deified after his death and worshipped for 2,000 years, and whose name the Greeks adopted as a name for Asclepius, the god of medicine. Amos-pen-Nekhbet, the soldier whose autobiography on the walls of his tomb gives us the most vivid first-hand account of the wars of the early New Kingdom. Ka, the artisan of Deir el-Medina whose intact tomb gave us the most complete picture of the working life of the craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs. Ani, the scribe whose papyrus copy of the Book of the Dead is the most beautiful and complete copy of that text that survives, and whose journey through the Hall of Two Truths to the weighing of the heart before Osiris is described in language of such quiet power that it speaks across the 3,000-year interval as clearly as if it had been written this morning. The names are preserved, the river still flows, and somewhere beneath the sands that the wind moves in slow patterns across the desert surface, beneath the fields that the farmers of the Nile Valley still work in the rhythms that have not changed fundamentally since the Neolithic, beneath the foundations of the modern cities that have grown up over the ancient ones, there are things waiting to be found, things that no living person has seen, things that will add new chapters to the extraordinary story of the civilization that built its house of eternity on the banks of the reefed span of time that makes everything else in recorded human history seem brief. The river runs north. The sun rises over the eastern desert and sets over the western desert, and the stars wheel overhead in the patterns that the ancient Egyptians mapped with such precision and named with such passion and named with such poetry and incorporated into the design of their greatest monuments. The ibis moves through the shallows at the river's edge. The egret stands motionless on the bank. The hoopoe calls from somewhere in the papyrus reeds. The great heron, the bird that the ancient Egyptians called the Banu and believed to be the form taken by the soul of the sun god at the moment of creation, rises from the water on its wide grey wings and flies toward the north, following the river, following the course that everything in this world eventually follows, the course of the river as it moves toward the sea. The sun has set. The western sky holds the last of the light in bands of orange and gold and deep rose that fade as you watch into the purple of approaching night. The first stars appear and Sirius the brightest, the star whose annual appearance on the horizon just before dawn announced the approaching flood, the star that the Egyptians associated with Isis and that still rises and sets in the same pattern it followed when the pyramids were being built. The sky darkens, the stars multiply. the river catches the starlight and holds it in long, trembling reflections that move with the current, moving north, always toward the sea, always continuing. The water laps at the reeds along the bank. Somewhere across the river, a night bird calls once and falls silent. The darkness is complete, and in the darkness the river moves and the stars move, and somewhere beneath the surface of the night that covers everything with equal patience, the ancient world is still present, not as a ruin or a memory, but as a living fact, the fact of the stone that was cut and placed by human hands, and that is still there, the fact of the words that were written by human minds, and that is still legible, the fact of the beauty that was made by human hearts, and that is still legible, the fact of the beauty that was made by human hearts, and that is still legible. They encounters it across whatever distance of time. The current pulls, the water turns south to north, as it always has, as it always will, as long as the rains fall in the mountains and the river finds its way to the sea. The ancient ones who lived along this river understood that the river was not just a physical fact, but a cosmic principle, the principle of renewal, of the return of what had seemed to depart, of the life that comes from what appeared to be death, of the green that rises from the black earth after the waters recede. They built their civilization on this principle. They organized their religion around it. They made their art and their architecture and their literature in its image. And they were right to do so, because the river does redoon, the green does rise from the black, and the sun, which dies each evening in the west, is reborn each morning in the east with the same light it has always had, the same light that fell on the face of the young farmer watching the first floodline creep across his fields 10,000 years ago, the same light that struck fire from the gold capstone of the Great Pyramid when it was first set in place, the same light that fills the inner sanctuary of Abu Simbel twice a year and illuminates the face of the kid who had then carried the same light, the same river, the same stars. Would you bull? The bitruatitin bidisiv, the bitruatin mabusiv dalwable, even chicken with the seed. That chibolted, torning, the bench about. The British South Simbeats, they can bust him out to watch, firm lead, even the bonds trip illustrated, but do the boo. If the fishing beams, the bait, which the bait was in us other, we found it worthy with both, that it was in us, and I was gemate, a bait, a duade, it was to us, but with webbed big hands, they can. Well, the bow stands where we church wode, and feels what to withy stood, and lick stupid, the bait, the would shoot, at neat, but be the beart, at the break to wait, big bait. The big overcheat, the big darchic big great deep wood. The water moves north. The stars wheel slowly in the patterns they have always followed. The night birds call across the dark water. The river carries everything with it, as it always has, as it always will. The black silt and the fallen reed and the reflection of the stars and the memory of everything that has happened on its banks and the possibility of everything that will happen still. The Nile flows, Egypt endures. The gift of the river is given again, as it is given every day, as it has been given since before memory began, as it will be given long after the last human memory has faded into the silence that surrounds all things, and from which all things emerge, and to which all things in their time return. The water laps, the night bird calls, the river moves, and the silence holds everything, the way the desert holds the monuments, the way the darkness holds the stars, the way the water holds the reflection of the light, quietly, patiently, eternally, the way Egypt has always held its secrets and its beauties and its dead and its living, with the infinite patience of stone and the infinite generosity of water and the infinite stillness of the desert night under which the river runs and the stars burn, and the ancient world of the present world are for a moment the same world, the same night, the same stars, the same song, the same songs,